When I was a kid, my parents would sometimes bring me down to my aunt and uncle's place to stay for the weekend. Mainly, I'd spend time playing with my two cousins who were around the same age as me. They lived on a small farm with plenty of open space, and we could run around doing pretty much whatever we wanted. If we thought we could get away with it, the three of us would sometimes cross over to the neighboring farm about half a mile away. It had been abandoned for decades, with a scattering of derelict buildings and other structures still standing on the property, just begging to be explored. This was of course a gold mine for three adventurous young boys such as ourselves, especially after my cousins told me stories about the deaths that took place in the house. It was pretty classic fare. Man goes crazy, axe murders his entire family, hangs himself, returns every night as an angry spirit looking for new victims. Good, grisly stuff. Even at that age, I knew they were probably making it up, or at least embellishing old rumors. But seeing as how the setting lent itself so well to such tales, I allowed myself to buy into it. One afternoon, we decided to play hide and seek. When it was my turn to hide, I ran off for a flimsy brown barn that had living quarters on top and climbed the stairs looking for a good spot. There was still furniture inside, and personal belongings lay scattered across the floor. I maneuvered over broken dishes, tattered clothes, and crumbling books, eventually coming to a small room with a closet. Jackpot. There were even long black dresses still hanging on the rod that I could hide behind. I stepped inside and managed to force shut the folding door. My only illumination was a slit of sunlight that shone through the crack in the door from a nearby window. I crouched down with knees tucked into chest and waited. Some time passed and there was still no sign of my seekers. I waited some more, debating if and when I should give myself up. After nearly an hour, this was starting to get boring. My head drooped. I awoke with a jerk. It was pitch black. Drowsy and confused, I forgot for a minute where I was or what I had been doing. As it came back to me, the realization that it was now nighttime and that I had been abandoned here filled me with sinking dread in the pit of my stomach. I tried to get up, but a sudden cramp in my calf kept me grounded. I squirmed about, waiting for it to pass, when I heard a door slamming shut downstairs, and instantly froze. One of my cousins? There was a brief period of silence, then footsteps at the bottom of the stairs. But not just footsteps, a thud too. After every other step. These weren't the footfalls of a child. They were slow, heavy, deliberate. I held my breath, praying they would go away. They did not. The noises continued to ascend. After another moment of silence, the walking resumed, this time along with a steady scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floorboards. The footsteps made their way through the debris and wandered aimlessly through the various rooms. I thought I could smell something faintly putrid. The constant scrape sent cold shivers coursing down my arms and back. My worst fears were realized when the steps reached the bedroom doorway. They got closer and closer and finally stopped directly in front of the closet door. I couldn't see a thing. After an agonizing pause, they continued on over to the other side of the room and out the doorway again. They faded away down the hallway. I waited for what seemed like an eternity. There were no more sounds now, and I was trying to build up enough courage to open the door and flee. 3 things happened simultaneously just then. I was bombarded with a smell I can only describe as fresh roadkill. I heard raspy breathing behind me in the dark closet, and I felt hot breath against the nape of my neck. That was enough for me to hurtle myself out from the confines of that nightmare space, relying on memory and scant moonlight to navigate through the darkened house. All the while, I heard footsteps chasing behind me, closing in with terrifying speed. It was a clumsy, torturous escape full of trips and bumps and blind stumbling. I never looked back, at least not until I had burst out the front door and into the country night. And when I did turn around, I saw absolutely nothing. There were no more footsteps and nobody was chasing me. That didn't stop me from running though, all the way back to my aunt and uncle's house. There was a police car in the driveway when I got back. My parents were there too, worried sick. Everybody demanded to know where I had been. Apparently, when my cousins still hadn't found me by evening, they'd returned home to tell their parents. Eventually, the police were called in and informed me that they had already scoured every building on the farm. The insinuation that I was lying about my whereabouts didn't go unnoticed. None of it made any sense. It wasn't until years later that one of my cousins filled in a final piece of the story. He and his brothers had spent hours searching for me like they said, but the part they didn't tell anyone was that they thought they spotted me in the window of the bedroom I was hiding in. And when they got closer, they saw that it wasn't me. A young boy neither of them recognized was smiling and waving down at them and gesturing for them to come upstairs. That's when they ran back home. All of this while I slept in the closet. A few months ago, I was over at my friend's house down the block. In fact, that's where most of my friends on the block actually are. I'm 16 years old right now, the second oldest out of the group of kids down the block. There's Alan, who's 17, Dan, who's in the same grade as me but a little younger, Johnny, who's 14, Daniela, who's also 14, Nick, who's 13, and Tom, who's only 12 years old. There's a big age gap between some of us, but we're really the only kids on the entire block. Me and Dan were the closest friends, and we kind of just met all the other kids who lived around the area while we hung out originally. It started to become our Friday night tradition to play a big game of Manhunt by Daniela and Nick's house. We don't live in a typical suburban neighborhood. Our area is a lot more spacious and overall has a lot less people and houses. And for that reason, there wasn't a lot going on in our area, but it also made the game that much more fun. It was our turn to hide first. I had 3 other kids on my team, but more notably, I had Dan on my team. Me and Dan both went next door to Mr. Nelson's old house. He was an old man who passed away a few years ago, and since then, no one has bought the house, leaving it vacant and a perfect property to add space for our game. Me and Dan went to the back section of the property by the lake, where we found a perfect hiding spot in some of his bushes. Dan, however, wanted to try something crazy and entered the vacant house through a sliding window, so I waited alone in the bushes. The goal of the game was to get back to Nick's house, which was always considered home base. A big part of the game is waiting. I was in those bushes for like 5 minutes, until I finally saw 2 kids from the other team entering the backyard looking for us. They were making a lot of noise, making their presence known. Once they left, the 2 of them continued even further down the block, giving us the perfect chance to run. I looked around at all the windows of the house, hoping Dan would be standing near one of them for me to wave him on. And when I looked up to one of the upstairs windows, I was relieved to see his head looking down to me. I waved him on, letting him know it's time to go, but he didn't move. Now I wasn't sure if he could see me. I went over to the window that he entered through, opened it, entered the house, and yelled up into the house calling Dan's name. I'm not even exaggerating when I say I felt like my heart stopped when I heard Dan's voice only a few feet away from me saying, "Dude, shh." I asked him how he got downstairs so quickly, and he just looked confused. He then told me he was sitting down here this whole time. At that same moment, we both looked up to the ceiling as there was a creaking sound coming from upstairs. We both hopped back out the window and ran back to Nick's house, where we called the game off. We went to ask Dan's dad if somebody had moved into the home, but he was positive that nobody had lived there for 3 years. Me, Alan, Dan, and Dan's dad all went over to the house, where we entered the same way we had earlier. Dan's dad was familiar with the house as he used to be good friends with Mr. Nelson. He led the way upstairs into the bathroom with a window I had seen someone standing at. He flicked on the lights, and besides a crumpled up reddish-brown blanket on the floor, the room was empty. We went through the entire house and found nothing. Dan's dad really didn't know what to do from there, so he just said if any of us, including him, ever see anything or anyone in that house, we would report it to the police immediately. It's been a few months already and we haven't seen anything since, but I know that somebody, besides Dan, was in that house that night. I used to play a lot of hide and seek with my friends when we were young. A team version of the game though, so it was a little different. Instead of having a lone seeker who tags anybody, we would have a team of seekers and a team of hiders. And for the hiders to win, they would have to get to a certain checkpoint, and seekers would win if they tagged all the hiders. To tag one of the hiders, the seeker would have to two-hand touch their back, just like touch football. It started when we all formed our group on the block around 8 years old, all the way up until we were about 13. I lived in a cul-de-sac where there were 3 other houses besides mine, and kids my age lived in each one. There were also 4 other kids right outside the cul-de-sac around our age, so ever since I was little I had a group of neighboring friends. When we would play hide and seek, we would usually play in the cul-de-sac, since there was a lot of open space, trees, bushes, and each of the houses belonged to one of us, so we could use all the property space for the game as well. Plus, the cul-de-sac was right in front of our town's nature preserve park, so it also made it more fun to have the woods as an added hiding spot. It was 2008. I was 11 years old, a time and age we would still play hide and seek on Friday nights instead of going out to flirt with girls. We had only 6 of us this night, so we divided our 2 teams into 3s and split up. We were first to hide. The other team began counting down from 30, while we all went our separate ways to different houses. I ran to my next door neighbor's house and came up with a really creative idea. My friend had a green blanket outside on his patio, sitting under a couple flower pots. I carefully moved the flower pots and took the green blanket, folding it over my body and crawling over to the bushes near the edge of the woods. Since our houses met the edge of the nature preserve, we could all choose if we wanted a back fence or not, and my next door neighbors chose not to have one, meaning the woods connected to some of our backyards. I heard the backyard gate open, so I quickly ran into the woods and knelt down under the green blanket. I would occasionally lift the blanket over my head to see who was there, and eventually I saw one of my friends creeping around the backyard, checking under the table and such. So while they were distracted, I waddled on my knees to the backyard of the next house over, where I could hear the commotion of one of my teammates getting caught. I lifted the blanket over my head to see what was going on, and I saw someone on the other team escorting my teammate back outside to the street. This was the perfect opportunity for me to run for it. I dropped the blanket completely and just looked around one last time before getting ready to make a break for it. Then, the most unexpected happened. The sound of a shoe on freshly fallen leaves and twigs snapped from right behind my ears, and before I could even turn around, I felt 2 hands grab my shoulders with a very strong and tight grip. I squealed in pain for a bit and screamed stop, managing to escape the grip and run for the checkpoint. I didn't make it to the checkpoint anyway though, because I ran into one of the seekers right at the backyard gates. We went out to the street where I found out that both of my teammates were already out, and the 2 other seekers were already waiting by the street. "Wait," I said. "If all of you guys are already out here, who was the one who found me in the woods?" I asked. They all looked at each other, seemingly confused. None of them owned up to it. They all swore they hadn't even gone into the woods. As I realized they were telling the truth, I felt my heart skip a few beats before pumping back up in a rapid beat, twice as fast as normal. When I told them that somebody was in the woods and grabbed me with force, they didn't believe me at first, but I convinced them. We all went to tell our parents, and the cops were called. Unfortunately for my neighbor friend, his parents put up a 4th fence wall, separating the woods to the backyard. We continued to play hide and seek and flashlight tag past this incident up until around the age of 13. Our parents just made us carry flashlights from now on and left all the backyard lights on. And of course, the woods were off limits. I'm happy to have such fond memories with friends as a young child, but that still doesn't take away from the fact that this was one of the most horrifying experiences of my life. This happened when I was 10 years old. I lived in a small town in New York State that didn't have much going on at all. The house next door to mine was vacant for the longest time, until one day a moving truck pulled up in front, and a woman, a kid my age, and a toddler stepped out. Me and my dad had been sitting on the stoop talking, so we were able to go over and greet them right away. The mom seemed pretty normal, though there was something slightly off about her personality. My dad and the mom introduced me and the other boy my age to each other. He introduced himself as CJ, and then reached out his hand for a handshake, which for kids our age at the time was very weird. I shook his hand, and I remember both of our parents laughed. My dad ended up pressuring me on the spot to go hang out with CJ upstairs in my room. I wasn't against it, so I led him up to my room. I sat down on my bed, and he just stared at me blankly, creepily. I asked him if he wanted to play Mario Kart, and he didn't even know what that was. I showed him a few of my video games, and he said he doesn't like video games, so I suggested we play hide and seek outside. That he agreed to. I told him he could hide first to familiarize himself with the properties, while I gave him a 60-second head start. He ran into his new backyard, and I started counting down from 60. When it came time to find him, I found him in literally the most obvious place he could be. He was standing behind the chimney, a spot that I had to pass to get into the backyard. From this point on, I was starting to wonder if maybe this kid wasn't all there. After 10 minutes of an anticlimactic game of hide and seek, I said I had homework to do. He asked if he could come inside with me, and I didn't know what to say. Every excuse I came up with, he would find another way of asking to come inside. Eventually, however, he did leave me alone, and I went inside. Realistically, I had nothing to do. I just didn't like the kid and didn't want to further any kind of friendship with him. That night, something terrifying happened. I awoke to a thud at my bedside window. I sat up and lifted the window up. I was disturbed to see CJ's face at the upstairs window of the neighboring house. He leaned out his window and called out for me to come over and play hide and seek. I yelled over he's insane and told him to go back to sleep and leave me alone. I aggressively slammed my window shut, as well as the blind, and tried to go back to sleep. Two more times a rock or something was thrown at my window, but I ignored it. When it seemed to stop, I was relieved, and finally felt at ease. 10 minutes or so later, I heard a noise coming from below my window outside. It sounded like a bird was hopping around the ledge or something, possibly. The sound kept getting closer though, and then I heard a thud come from right below my window. I didn't know what to think. What if CJ was out there? Was he trying to climb up to my window? The thought of it was so disturbing it was almost comical. Then I heard the slightest creak of the floorboards near my bedroom door. I turned to face the doorway and screamed at the sight of CJ standing at my door in his pajamas. He said in a quiet voice, "Let's play hide and seek." My dad was in the room quicker than I could even get out of my bed. He was just as shocked and disturbed as I was. He angrily marched over to the new neighbor's house with CJ in his grip. I watched the whole thing through my window. He raised his voice quite a few times. It turned out CJ simply entered through an unlocked window downstairs. My dad got a restraining order against the woman and her son. Unfortunately, they weren't going anywhere though. For months after this incident, I would have to awkwardly avoid eye contact with the mother next door the few times I saw her. Strangely, I never once saw CJ outside of the house again. However, every single night for over a month, I would check outside my bedroom window across to the other house and see CJ just sitting by his window looking into mine with his creepy blank stare. It got to a point where I eventually left the blinds to that window closed 24/7, and eventually it stopped. CJ and his mom moved out less than a year later, and luckily I never saw them again.
One, two, three, 4, 5.
I was 15 when it happened. It was a Friday night in late September, just starting to get cold where I lived. My parents went out to dinner with some family friends, and they said they would not be home until late. I had the house to myself. I invited over my neighbor and best friend Chris. He was the same age as me and lived across the street. We usually hung out in my basement and played games or watched movies, but that night we got bored. At some point, he brought up playing hide and seek. It sounded dumb at first, but we had done it before with a group, and it had been fun. The house was small, but it had a lot of places to hide, especially in the dark. We turned off most of the lights to make it scarier. The only light on was in the kitchen. The rules were simple. No going outside, no going into the attic or the crawl space. Basement, bedrooms, closets, and under furniture were all fair game. Chris wanted to hide first, so I covered my eyes in the living room and counted to 50. I could hear him running at first, and then silence. I finished counting and announced that I was coming. I started in the kitchen since it was right there, but there was nowhere good to hide. I checked behind the basement door, then down the hall. I looked in the bathroom. Empty. I opened the closet near the front door. Nothing. I went upstairs. The floor creaked under me, and every little sound made me tense. I checked my parents' bedroom first, looking under the bed and behind the dresser. Nobody. I went down the hall into my room. It was messy, but not enough for Chris to hide well. I still checked the closet and under the desk. Nothing. That left the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open. I pushed it slowly, expecting him to jump out and scare me, but the room was dark and quiet. I stepped inside and scanned around. I bent down to look under the bed. Nothing. I opened the closet door. Empty. At that point, I thought maybe he was in the basement, so I went back downstairs. I checked behind the laundry machines and in the storage space under the stairs. I was about to give up when I finally found him curled up behind some boxes. He laughed and asked how long it had taken me. I told him way too long. Then we switched. He counted and I hid. I went upstairs and slid under the guest bed, pulling the bed skirt down to cover me. My heart raced while I lay there in the dark. I heard him come upstairs a few minutes later, his footsteps slow and heavy on the floor. He opened the bathroom door first, then he stepped into my parents' room. After a while, the footsteps came down the hall toward where I was. I could hear him breathing as he walked into the guest room. He stopped near the bed. I held my breath. His shoes shuffled against the carpet. Then silence. A long silence. I thought he had figured it out and was about to yank up the bed skirt, but instead, he walked out. I lay there a few more minutes, waiting to hear him call that I had won, but the house stayed too quiet. Finally, I crawled out. I went downstairs expecting to find him on the couch, but he wasn't there. I called out that the game was over. A voice came from the basement saying he was down there. I thought he was messing with me. I walked to the basement door, opened it, and shouted down the stairs. He shouted back that he was still looking for me, and he asked where I was hiding. That made my stomach twist. I told him I was out now and standing in the kitchen. A second later, I heard him coming up the stairs. He stepped into the light and looked confused. He asked how I had gotten upstairs so fast. I told him I had been under the guest bed the whole time. He frowned and said he could have sworn he checked that room, and he heard someone moving inside. He said he thought he heard breathing. I told him I stayed perfectly still. We argued a little, but then we just shrugged it off. We played another round, but the whole time I felt uneasy. Every creak in the house made me jump. At one point while I was counting, I thought I heard something upstairs, like a soft thud, but when I searched, it was empty. I found Chris in the laundry room. We kept playing until we both got tired. Then we sat on the couch in the living room and turned the TV back on. That's when we both froze. From upstairs came a loud bump, like something heavy falling. Chris asked if it was my parents. I reminded him they were still gone. The hair on my arm stood up. We sat there waiting, but the house went silent again. Chris said maybe something slid off a shelf. I wanted to believe that, but then, while we sat listening,
We both heard it clearly. A slow creak of floorboards, the sound of someone walking down the hall upstairs. We stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then I whispered that maybe we should check. Chris shook his head, saying no way, but if someone had broken in, we couldn't just sit there. I told him to stay behind me and grab the fireplace poker from beside the couch. We went to the stairs and started creeping up. The house was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. The steps groaned under our weight. When we reached the top, I pointed toward the guest room. The door was closed now. I knew for a fact I had left it cracked open. We stood there frozen. Then from behind the door came a sound, a slow dragging noise, like fabric sliding across the carpet. Chris whispered that we should leave. I wanted to, but curiosity and fear kept me in place. I raised the poker and reached for the knob. When I tell you my hands were shaking, I'm not just saying that to be dramatic for the story. I pushed the door open fast. The room was dark, but the shape of the bed and the dresser were visible. Nobody was there. The closet door stood half open. I moved closer as Chris stayed in the doorway. I yanked the closet door open. Inside was nothing but coats and boxes. We both let out shaky laughs, pretending it was all in our heads. But then, just as we turned to leave, we heard another sound. This time it wasn't upstairs. It was downstairs. The sound of the front door opening and closing. We froze again. Chris whispered that someone was in the house. I felt my stomach drop. We ran down the hall and crouched in my room with the lights off. I held the poker tight. We listened, and at first there was nothing. Then there were faint footsteps on the first floor. I wanted to call the police, but my phone was on the couch where we had been sitting. I whispered that maybe we could sneak out the window, but it was too small. The only way out was down the hall past the stairs. The footsteps moved closer. We heard the basement door open, then the steps went down one by one. We both exhaled in relief. Whoever it was had gone into the basement, so we took that time to run. We sprinted down the stairs through the kitchen and out the back door into the yard. We didn't stop until we reached Chris's house across the street. His parents were home, and when we told them what happened, they called the police. The officers searched my house from top to bottom. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry or anyone hiding in the basement. They told us it was probably just the house settling, or our imagination running wild while we played. But Chris and I both knew what we heard. We knew someone had been inside. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep well. Every creak made me think someone was in the hallway. That was the last time I played hide and seek ever. We're too old for it anyway. Chris and I never talked much about it again, but sometimes when we look at each other, I can tell we're both remembering that night. The night hide and seek turned into something else. Even now, years later, I still think about the sound of the closet door, the dragging noise in the carpet, and the footsteps on the first floor. We never found out who it was. Maybe a burglar who realized we were still home. Maybe someone who slipped out when we ran. All I know is that playing hide and seek that night showed us just how scary it is to realize you aren't alone in your own house. I grew up in a neighborhood that backed right up against a stretch of woods. The houses lined one side of the street, and behind them was nothing but trees for miles. When I was younger, a group of us kids from the street used to play together almost every weekend. In the summer, we stayed out late into the night, sometimes until our parents yelled for us to come home. One of our favorite games was hide and seek. We usually played in the backyards and into the edge of the woods. It was fun during the day, but at night it was different. The trees swallowed up the light and everything looked the same no matter where you were. That was what made it scary, and that was what made it fun. The last time I ever played hide and seek in those woods was when I was 14. It was August, hot and humid even at night. There were 5 of us, me, my friend Tyler, his little brother Matt, and 2 kids from down the street, Jason and Eric. We all decided to play outside because it felt cooler than sitting in someone's basement. The rule was simple. You could hide anywhere in the backyards or in the woods, but you had to stay close enough to hear when the seeker called the round over. Jason volunteered to be it first. The rest of us ran off. I went into the woods with Tyler. We split up once we passed the first row of trees. I crouched behind a fallen log, my heart beating hard even though it was just a game. I could hear Jason shouting numbers back in the yard, his voice echoing through the night. When he finished, everything went quiet. Crickets buzzed around me and the leaves rustled in the wind. I stayed low and still. After a while, I heard footsteps in the leaves. They were moving between the trees. I thought it was Jason. I held my breath and waited for him to pass. The footsteps stopped not far from me. Whoever it was stood there. I waited for them to call out or move again, but they didn't. I felt my skin prickle. I almost whispered to ask who it was, but then I remembered the rules. If I gave myself away, I would lose, so I stayed still. Finally, the steps started again. They crunched through the leaves, moving deeper into the woods. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. I peeked over the log, but it was too dark to see far. The moonlight only lit up the tops of the trees. I stayed hidden a few more minutes before I got tired of waiting. I crawled out and started creeping back toward the yards. As I walked, I heard Jason calling that the round was over and everyone should come out. I hurried back and found the others already in the yard. Jason had found Tyler and Eric, but not me or Matt. Matt came running out of the woods a minute later, covered in dirt. He laughed and said nobody would have found him. I told them that I had been behind the log and almost got caught when Jason walked right past me, but Jason looked confused. He said he never went that far into the woods. He said he only circled near the first trees and then found Tyler crouched by a fence. I squinted my eyes in confusion and then asked who it was that walked by me, but everyone just shrugged. We brushed it off and kept playing. The next round, I was seeker. I counted loud against a tree while the others scattered. When I finished, I searched the yards first. I found Eric hiding behind a shed and Tyler in the bushes. Then I went into the woods to look for Jason and Matt. The woods were quiet except for the bugs. My flashlight beam swung through the trees. I listened carefully, trying to catch movement. After a while, I spotted Matt crouched near a tree trunk. I shouted that I had him, and he ran back laughing. That left Jason. I searched deeper, calling out that I was coming. That was when I heard it again, the footsteps. The slow, heavy footsteps moving in the dark. They came from just ahead of me. I shined the flashlight that way, but the trees were thick. I walked slowly, trying not to make noise. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Now, admittedly, I was getting a little nervous. Then I heard Jason call from behind me that the round was over. I spun around. He was already walking back to the yard. Confused, I asked if he had just been ahead of me. He said no. He had been hiding closer to the house the whole time. I felt my stomach twist. Twice now I had heard someone moving through the woods who wasn't one of us. I told myself it was probably an animal, but the steps had sounded human. Too heavy to be a raccoon or a fox, even a deer. We played a few more rounds. Every time I hid, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there. I kept hearing faint noises in the trees, branches snapping, leaves crunching. At one point, I even thought I saw a shadow move between the trees. But when I aimed my flashlight, it was gone. The others didn't notice anything. They just kept laughing and running. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the nervous pit in my stomach. The last round of the night, Jason wanted to hide in the woods again. We all split up like before. I didn't want to go too far, so I stayed near the edge. I crouched low in the tall grass. I could see the faint glow of the porch lights through the trees. I heard Jason's faint voice in the distance counting. When he was done, there was once again silence. After a few minutes, I heard something that froze me in place. It was whispering. A low voice, too soft to make out the words, but it was close. My whole body tensed up. I peeked over the grass, but the woods were empty. I listened hard, but the whispering had stopped. A moment later, I heard footsteps again. They moved past me and into the trees. I lay trembling. That was when Jason called that the game was over. Everyone else came out, laughing and brushing dirt off themselves. I walked back slowly, my heart still racing. I told them I had heard someone whispering, but they all just laughed and said I was trying to scare them. I didn't argue, but I knew what I heard. We sat in Tyler's yard after that, drinking soda and talking. That was when Matt asked if anyone else had noticed the man. We all stopped and looked at him. He said while he was hiding, he thought he saw a tall man standing in the woods. He said the man didn't move, just stood there watching. Jason told him he was crazy. Eric laughed it off, but I felt sick because I believed him. We ended the night soon after. Everyone went home. I lay in bed that night, staring at my ceiling, unable to sleep. I kept hearing the whispering in my head, the slow crunch of footsteps in the leaves. I never played hide and seek in the woods again. Even now, years later, whenever I hear leaves crunch underfoot in the dark, I think back to that night. I think about that man that Matt said he saw. I think about the footsteps that weren't Jason's, and the whisper that I still can't explain. Maybe it was a stranger passing through. Maybe it was someone who lived out there. All I know is that when you hide in the dark woods, you never really know who else is hiding with you. It was a hot Saturday afternoon last July. I was 14 at the time, and I live out in the rural part of Pennsylvania. My backyard is huge. We have acres of open grass, trees, and an old storage shed at the edge of the yard. My friends and I spent almost every summer day out there. That day, it was me, Ryan, Josh, Adam. We were just messing around playing basketball on the hoop my dad put up near the garage. We played for about an hour before we were all tired and sitting in the grass, sweaty and drinking water. That's when we saw a kid we didn't recognize who came walking up from the dirt road that runs past my house. He looked about 16, older than us, taller too. He had black hair that was kind of messy and wore a gray shirt and jeans, even though it was hot out. We all stopped talking when we noticed him. He walked right up like he already knew us. He asked if we wanted to even the teams out and make it 3-on-3. None of us answered right away. Finally, Adam asked who he was. The kid said his name was Keith. He said he lived just up the road and was just walking through the woods when he saw us. We all kind of looked at each other. I've lived here my whole life and never saw this kid once. Neither had my friends. But he acted normal enough, I guess. Ben asked him if he wanted to play basketball. Keith shook his head and suggested we play manhunt instead. He said my yard was perfect for it since there were so many spots to hide. In the moment, I don't think any of us gave that comment a second thought, but in hindsight, that should have been a red flag. How would this kid know anything about my property? We all agreed to play. It sounded more fun than standing around in the heat. We split into 2 teams. Keith immediately volunteered to be on the hunting team first. He said he loved being the seeker. So it was Keith, Adam, and Josh hunting, and me, Ryan, and Ben hiding. Adam kicked a soccer ball to signal the start. We ran off into the yard while the hunters covered their eyes and counted. Ryan took off toward the tree line. Ben sprinted for the side of the garage. I didn't want to hide in the woods yet, so I went into the storage shed. It always smells like gasoline and old wood in there. I found a pile of folded tarps in the corner, so I climbed under one and lay still. I stayed under there for at least 10 minutes, but it felt like forever. Nobody came. I started thinking maybe the hunters had given up, but then the shed door creaked open. The tarp ripped off me in one quick motion. I guess it was an obvious spot. I looked up to Adam's smiling face. We both walked back to the patio. A few minutes later, Ben showed up. He'd been caught too. Eventually, Adam and Josh walked back. We all stood around drinking water, but Keith wasn't there. At first, nobody said anything. Then Josh asked where Keith went. None of us knew. We waited another 10 minutes, thinking he'd come walking back any second, but he never did. Adam finally shrugged and said maybe he was just some weird kid and left. The rest of us agreed, even though it felt strange that he would just disappear without saying anything. When the others left around sunset, I went inside. That's when I noticed something odd near my bedroom window. On the grass was this piece of rope. It was weathered and dirty, like it had been outside for months, but I know it hadn't been there earlier. I picked it up and tossed it aside, but it stuck in my head. The first thought I had was Keith. I told myself I was overthinking, but later that evening, I couldn't stop wondering if he'd gone inside the house while we were distracted. My dad usually leaves one of the side doors unlocked during the day. I went room by room, checking closets and under beds. Nothing. That night, I got ready for bed around 11. I laid there for maybe an hour scrolling on my phone when I heard something. Soft footsteps outside my door. I froze. My dad sometimes gets up at night to use the bathroom, but he always coughs or clears his throat. This was quiet. Too quiet. I called out for my dad. No answer. I sat up with my pulse racing. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I finally got up and locked it. I stood there, staring at the handle, waiting. After about 30 seconds, I heard the front door shut. The sound carried through the whole house. I didn't waste a second. I ran to my dad's room and shook him awake. He groggily sat up while I explained what I heard. He didn't doubt me. He grabbed the shotgun from under his bed and told me to stay close. We searched the whole house together. Every closet, the basement, the garage. He even went outside and walked the property with a flashlight, but he didn't find anything. We locked every door and window after that. The next day, I told my friends, and they all laughed it off, saying Keith was probably just some weirdo passing through. But Ryan admitted he thought Keith was strange too. He said Keith barely talked during the game. He just stared at people. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, a scratching sound woke me up. It was coming from my bedroom window. I froze, staring at the blinds. The scratching was slow, like someone dragging a stick or nail against the glass. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I carefully bent one of the blinds open just a crack. On the other side of the window was a figure. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of someone standing inches away in the dark. I jumped back and screamed for my dad. I ran into the hallway, shouting until he came out of his room. He didn't hesitate. He ran outside with a shotgun, firing 2 rounds into the air. I heard him yelling that he'd shoot whoever was out here if they came back. The figure at the window was gone. The rest of the night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room with the lights on while my dad stayed up too. The next morning, he told me he thought Keith had been the one messing with us. He said if that kid showed up again, he'd shoot him. I know he wasn't fully serious, but that's just how my dad is. He said that kid isn't welcome anywhere near our house ever again. As far as I know, Keith never came back. But sometimes when I'm outside at night, I think about that rope by my window, and I wonder what he was planning to do if I hadn't woken up when I did. When shit hit the fan with my parents, I had to move out. I was down on my luck living situation-wise, and I could only crash on the couches of my friends for so long. I was looking on all the roommate and apartment apps and websites, and I found something that caught my eye on this app. A man named Luke had listed a room for rent in his 3-bedroom, 1-story house. The rent price was $1,200 a month. He'd basically be my landlord and roommate, as he would also be living in the house. He made sure to note on the ad that he'd be out of the house most of the time, and that the renter would have the place to themselves often. He did put in all capital letters a few ground rules though, including no parties, no large gatherings, no drinking in the living room, and no use of the basement. They seemed like pretty standard rules. I went to view the house in person and meet Luke. The second he opened the door, I got a bit of a read on him, that he was a little reclusive. His demeanor was quiet and a little awkward. He showed me the house. I could tell he was nervous because his voice would shake and he would stutter. The bedroom was a good size, and the actual floor plan of the house was good. It was an open layout, meaning the kitchen, living room, and dining room were all one big open space. For $1,000 a month in my area, it was a steal. He laid out some more ground rules in person, and he emphasized again how I can't go in the attic or the basement, as I use them for storage only. Sounded fair enough. On the spot, I told him I'm interested. We shook hands, I left, and 2 days later, I was moving in. We didn't draft any sort of lease or contract. I was just going to be paying him off the books month to month, the first day of every month. I had settled in pretty quickly. The bedroom I was renting was already furnished with a bed and basic furniture, so all I did really was hang some of my wall decor and fill the dresser and closet with clothes. The bedroom had a lock on it, thankfully, and he gave me the key to it so I could lock it when he wasn't home, which seemed like a nice gesture, at first. Luke never told me what he did for work. He just told me he usually wouldn't be home, but I quickly learned that wasn't true. Anytime I'd come home from work, his car was always in the driveway. Quickly, I started to pick up on loud sounds outside of my bedroom at night, from footsteps to doors opening and closing constantly. One night, I went out in the middle of the night just to go to the bathroom, and I noticed the basement door was opened. I walked over to the top of the stairs and looked down. There was a dim light from down there, seemingly from a far corner out of view. I heard banging sounds coming from down there. It was like 2 a.m. What could he be doing down there? Then the bangs stopped, and Luke appeared at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at me. It was so creepy that describing it in words doesn't do it justice. He looked visibly annoyed as he looked up at me. I apologized and said I'm just going to the bathroom. He almost angrily responded, "Shut the basement door." I listened to him, insanely weirded out. I went to the bathroom and then back to bed. I laid awake for a while after that, now with my mind racing, wondering what he's doing. About a week later, I returned home and noticed my bedroom door was unlocked. I always locked it before leaving every day. I looked around my room to see if anything was missing, and while nothing seemed to be missing, I noticed some things had been moved. For starters, my clothes in the dressers were not neatly stacked anymore. They had been looked through, I could tell. The closet door was also cracked open. It was dawning on me that he had his own key, and he likely came into my room and went through my stuff. This felt like a clear invasion of privacy and a violation of my tenant rights. I had to figure out how to confront him about it. I went to knock on his bedroom door, but he didn't answer. His car was in the driveway once again, so he had to be home. I was getting such weird vibes from all of this. I gave up and went back to my room after microwaving my dinner. While I was in my room relaxing and watching TV, I heard the door to Luke's room open. I took this opportunity to get up and confront him, so I went out to the living room and caught him in a hurry about to leave the house. I stopped him and asked if he went into my room. He looked at me with a blank expression and straight up said no. I delicately responded without being hostile, saying that the door was unlocked and some of my stuff appeared to have been gone through. He then claimed that I had the only key to my bedroom, and then he said he's in a hurry, he has to go, and he left. I was flabbergasted by all of this. I wanted to ask my parents for advice, but at that time I hated them and wanted nothing to do with them. I was already back on the apps and websites looking up other listings. I knew I didn't want to stay here. Then I realized this was the first apparent time that Luke wasn't home while I was. Curiosity got the better of me, and I had to check out the basement. I checked out the windows first to make sure his car was gone, and it was. I then went over to open the basement door. Oddly enough, I couldn't find any light switches, so I just used the flashlight on my phone to navigate around. The steps were so creaky I felt like I was in an abandoned house. I got to the bottom, and there was a tan carpet that was curling upwards at the walls as if it were poorly fitted to the floor. It was a very small basement, at least the main room. There was just this one ugly couch in the middle of the room. There was also a slightly funky smell down there, and the smell only got worse as I got closer to this door in the corner. I attempted to open the door, but unfortunately it was locked. Or maybe I should say fortunately, because I'm not sure I fully wanted to know what was in there, emitting that smell. It almost smelled like raw sewage, but worse. I did one little quick sweep around the main room of the basement though, and I found nothing, just some taped up cardboard boxes which I was not going to open. I went back upstairs and shut the door. The rest of that night, I stayed in my room. I never heard Luke come back. He must have gotten back after I had fallen asleep. I woke up. The room was still dark. My alarm was not going off. Something else had woken me up. I heard the floor next to my bed crack, and I turned and saw Luke leaning over my bed, looking at me. I screamed, and he replied to me to shush, and then asked me if I went into the basement. I screamed, "No, how did you get in here? I locked the door." He then asked me, "Are you sure?" I flipped the cards on him and yelled, "Did you come into this room when I wasn't home?" He replied no. Then he turned around and walked toward the door. I asked, "How did you get in here then?" I saw him hold up his hand in the dark. He wasn't holding anything. At the time, I didn't know what it meant. He said to me before leaving the room, "I think you should find other living arrangements." And then he closed the door. I started packing my shit right then and there. I wasn't staying another minute in that house. I knocked on his door and yelled at him to give me half of the rent money back since I'd only been there like 2 weeks. Moments later, he opened the door, and just his arm stuck out from the door, holding a small stack of $100 bills. He managed to make even handing me the money insanely creepy. I grabbed it. It was only $400. Whatever, it was close enough. I just wanted to get out of there. I was fully packed and out of there within an hour. I slept in my car that night. I ended up back at my parents' house the next day, and after explaining the ludicrous shit I just went through, something changed where they were more welcoming to have me back. I still moved out a month later, but my parents and I are fine now. If you're choosing to have a random roommate from online, just be careful and use your best judgment after meeting them. It was my junior year of college. I had moved off campus into a student apartment building. My roommate was sort of assigned to me by the school, in the sense that he was just someone else who needed someone to live with. His name was David, and he seemed like a nice guy at first. He was friendly and polite, always smiling and making small talk. But as the days went by, I started to notice strange things about him. Little quirks and odd behaviors that made me feel uneasy. It started with the way David would always linger in my room, asking pushy questions about my personal life and poking around my belongings as if he were way too comfortable doing so. At first, I brushed it off as harmless curiosity, even if I found it kinda weird, but the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Then there were the sounds I would hear coming from David's room late at night, talking and shuffling noises that were slightly concerning. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just David watching TV or talking on the phone. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, unable to sleep because of the strange noises coming from David's room, I decided to investigate. I crept silently down the hallway and pressed my ear against David's door, straining to hear what was going on inside. What I heard was just weird. It was the sound of David whispering to himself, his voice low and muffled. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whisper stopped, and there was nothing but silence. Then I heard, "Jeff?" David said my name. Did he somehow know I was outside his door? I quickly and quietly tiptoed away from his door and back to my room. I silently crawled back into my bed. I didn't know what to make of this. Why was David talking to himself? Was he hiding something from me? Or was he sleepwalking? But then how did he know I was outside of his room? I couldn't shake the feeling of uneasiness. The next day, I kept thinking about the night before. As the days went by and the sounds from David's room persisted, my paranoia only grew worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that David was hiding something from me. David's behavior also became stranger. I started to notice little subtle changes in his behavior, like he would make strange glances at me, and his movements seemed a little furtive. One night, I woke up at some off hour in the night and heard David's whispering voice from outside in the hallway, like right outside my door. It was genuinely freaking me out, and I was wondering if he was sleepwalking. I went to the door and put my ear up against it, and like last time, the whispering stopped. And then, David once again said, "Jeff?" This time I replied and said, "Yeah, you good?" He didn't respond. I just heard his footsteps walk away to his room. The following night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door closing. I heard David's footsteps walking away in the hallway. This was getting out of hand. The next day, I decided to confront him about his potential sleepwalking. I told him I'd been hearing him walking around late at night and heard him close my door last night. I then asked him if he has ever been known to sleepwalk or have any kind of sleeping disorders. He seemed to not know how to answer at first, but then he said yes, he does tend to sleepwalk sometimes. I wasn't buying it though, something was up. I decided to search David's room for answers. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. I waited until David was out of the apartment, then I crept into his room. I knew that I might not have much time, so I searched quickly, tearing through drawers and closets in search of anything that might explain David's nightly strange behavior. And then, just as I was about to give up, I found it. A small, nondescript drawer hidden at the back of David's closet. I pulled it open, and my blood ran cold at what I found inside. It was a collection of photographs, dozens of them, mostly featuring me asleep and one other guy who looked to be our age, all mixed together. They were taken from different angles and distances, some of them so close up that I could see the pores on my skin and individual strands of hair on my head. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized what I was looking at. David had been secretly taking pictures of me while I slept without my knowledge or consent. I couldn't believe it. I had been living with some kind of sick voyeur, like he probably got off somehow to these pictures. He had been violating my privacy and invading my personal space for who knows how long. I wanted to confront David, to demand answers, but I was afraid of what he might do, afraid of what he might say, afraid of what might happen if I confronted him alone. So I took a picture of the contents of the drawer, and then took a handful of the photos as evidence to use against David. I packed my things, and the next day, I showed the photos to the department in charge of student housing accommodations, and they told me to let them take the appropriate action. I was lucky and got assigned to a different apartment with a normal person who needed a roommate. I never spoke to David again. Even now, years later, I still can't shake the memory of those chilling photographs, and David's whispering and creeping around at night. I never found out who the other guy in the photos was. It was definitely his old roommate, but I was never able to find his name. But who knows? Maybe he also found out. When I was 23, I had to move out of state for work. I still work with the company, but I've been able to move back to my hometown and work at the local office here. But at the time, I needed somewhere to live that wouldn't be bank-breaking. I made a posting on basically all the websites for a roommate: Facebook, Craigslist, Twitter, and even on my neighborhood subreddit. I had a guy named Rob reach out to me on Facebook, stating he has a room available in his place. I looked at his pictures to see if he looked like a somewhat normal guy, and he did. I was open to the idea of having a male roommate, as long as they seemed normal, even though my parents were very against it. Rob and I FaceTimed, during which he gave me a virtual tour of the place. Apparently he owned the place outright. It was a modest house in the middle of town, only a 10-minute drive from where my office would be. He also seemed pretty nice. I didn't get any bad vibes at all. His price was fair, and his rules were pretty fair too. He said it was available to move in right away, which was perfect. So it was settled. A week later, I had all my things packed and drove down. I met Rob right out front of the house, where he greeted me and handed me a key. The first thing I noticed about him was he was really short. He was eye level with me. He helped me bring some of the bigger and heavier bags inside. He showed me my room, which was furnished already. He said one of his friends had been living there and recently moved out. I replaced all the pillows and bed sheets with my own, of course. The rest of that day was me settling in. Rob, I could see, was trying to get to know me and presumably make me feel at home. I didn't get any overly friendly vibes yet. The next day was Sunday. Rob offered to drive me around town to show me around. I wasn't eager to, but I said sure, just to get off on a good start with him. He drove us around town, showing me where the good shopping centers are, good restaurants, and stuff like that. But then he offered to get us lunch. I really wasn't hungry, and he was suggesting a sit-down lunch, almost like a date. I didn't want him to get any kind of wrong idea, I just needed a room. I said I'm not hungry, and then he right away suggested we go grab drinks somewhere instead. I politely shot it down too, saying I don't drink on work nights. He was being a bit pushy, saying, come on, just a couple drinks. I still maintained my politeness and said another time. He gave up, and he went really quiet all of a sudden, like he was upset. I'll admit, I was slightly uncomfortable, but nothing I couldn't handle yet. That week was my first week at work, and so my attention was focused mostly on adjusting to the work week. It wasn't until a few days into the week that I got home and did my laundry, and noticed my hamper full of clothes seemed moved. Like the clothes weren't how I remembered they were left, and it wasn't until I was loading the washing machine that I noticed a pair of my underwear was missing. I checked my room top to bottom like 5 times, It was gone. I had a disturbing thought. What if Rob... No, I refused to believe that just yet, and there was no chance in hell I would confront him and ask him that. Still, I was now starting to wish there was a lock on the bedroom door. That weekend, I bought a lockable doorknob from Ace Hardware, and while Rob wasn't home, I swapped out the current doorknob with the new one. Now I could leave the place in peace. I figured I'd tell Rob the next time I saw him. He didn't come home that night, though. He must have been working. His schedule seemed pretty random. That night, I awoke to banging on my bedroom door. It was Rob. He was saying my name, and he didn't sound happy. I checked the time, and it was like 1:30 in the morning. I decided I would pretend I'm asleep. I was honestly kind of scared to open the door. I had a feeling it had to do with the doorknob, and I was right. The next morning, I woke up to a bunch of texts from Rob, saying, "We need to talk. Be home after work." I simply responded, "Is this about the doorknob?" And he responded back, "Yes." I apologized to him and said I was planning on telling him. He replied back, "It comes off today." I was getting incredibly nasty and weird vibes from his tone. My next response I thought out a little longer, and basically said how I hope he can sympathize and understand that I'm a girl and I just feel safer being able to have privacy in my room. He responded a little nicer this time, but he still basically said no to my request and that the old doorknob needs to go back on. I was confused, I was upset, but I had to respect his rules. I did also install it without telling him, so I felt like he had a right to be kind of mad. But how did he know I changed it? It's not like I had the old doorknob sitting out in the open. The idea that he tried coming into my room that night kind of scared me. I changed the doorknob back the next day and returned to Ace. This is where things went really downhill though. There was a knock at the door one day when Rob wasn't home. It was a girl around my age. She asked me if I was living here with Rob, and I said yes. She warned me to get out of there immediately, that Rob has multiple restraining orders against him from different girls, and he's known to be a very dangerous, creepy stalker. I was at a loss for words. I asked her how she knew I was here. She said she knew that he was trying to rent his room, and that it's not surprising he opted to have a girl move in. She said she saw me moving in and wanted to wait till he wasn't home to come warn me. I thanked her so much. I truly was terrified now. I had already paid Rob for the entire month. I didn't know what to do. She said she would help me in any way she could. I took her number and she left. I started packing my things and looking for other places I could move to. I found something across town, a studio apartment sublet for a little more money. I contacted the poster of the ad, and she told me I could move in as soon as possible. Perfect. Now I just needed to tell Rob and get my money back. I started packing some of my stuff into my car, and I texted him that I'd have to be moving out tomorrow, as something with my family came up and I needed to go home. He didn't answer. He got back to the house about an hour later and asked me about my text. I came up with my best fake story possible, and he said yeah, he'll give me the money back tomorrow after he goes to the bank. I was super relieved. About an hour later, he knocked on my door, and then said, "Did by some chance some girl say something to you?" I simply said, "No, what do you mean?" And he said, "Never mind, it just seems like you're running away out of here for another reason." I insisted that it was purely because of the family reasons. He said okay, and left. Sadly, the story didn't end there. I woke up that night and screamed at the top of my lungs when I saw a black figure sitting on the end of the bed. It was Rob. He turned and put his hand on my mouth and went, "Shh." I said, "Please don't hurt me." And he responded, "Why would I hurt you? I knew someone said something to you. Don't believe what these girls say." I said, "You're scaring me," and this part is still just as insane to me as it was in that moment. He started to caress my leg, and he said, "I don't mean to scare you," right after I said he's scaring me. I got out of the bed and ran for the door, and he screamed at me to stop. I ran outside with my phone in hand and called the police. I hid in the bush until they showed up, and I explained the entire situation to them. They made Rob come outside and give his side of the story. Basically, I told them I just want to get all my stuff out of the room and I'm leaving. So the cops stayed there as I collected the remainder of my stuff and brought it all to my car. I also insisted on Rob Venmoing me the money back while the police were there, and he did so actually. The whole time the police were there, he tried his best to act like some normal dude, I could tell. One of the officers then pulled me to the side to tell me that this guy had been arrested before for other incidents with women, but Rob denied ever coming in my room or touching me or anything, so it was all he said, she said. I left the house and went straight to a hotel for the night. The next day, I moved into the studio apartment. Luckily, the girl who posted it was able to facilitate my quick move-in. I have never and will never live with another man who's not my boyfriend or husband ever again, or just anyone I don't know for that matter. My cousin Nate is in the Coast Guard, and he has been for over a decade. He's not the kind of guy to lie or make things up. He's one of the most straightforward people I know. Real grounded and not superstitious, not into horror, just a practical guy who likes boats and order. He told me this story in the summer of 2022. I asked him to repeat it more than once because of how messed up it was, and every time, the details stayed the same. This happened back in 2017, when he was assigned to a lighthouse off the coast of Maine on a 2-week maintenance rotation. The place was called Matinicus Rock, and it's way out there. You can only get to it by boat or helicopter. It's nothing more than a jagged, rocky island with a single lighthouse and one auxiliary building that stores fuel and maintenance equipment. There's no power grid, no plumbing, and barely any cell signal. The lighthouse itself is automated, but it still requires occasional manual upkeep, which is why the Coast Guard sends people out to it every year or so. Usually it's a solo assignment, but there had been strange electrical failures the year before, so for this trip they decided to send 2 people, Nate and another guy named Russell. The first few days were fine, windy, boring, and repetitive. During the day, they check the beacon mechanics, test the emergency batteries, refill the diesel generator, and scrape off layers of salt corrosion from the metal interior. At night, they'd read, eat simple meals, and kill time playing cards. It was isolation, but it was expected. No red flags. Then, on the 4th night, Nate woke up around 2 in the morning feeling weird. Not sick, not in pain, just like something was wrong with the atmosphere. The air was heavier than usual, and he said it felt like standing in a room right before a thunderstorm, except the sky was clear and silent outside. He sat up and looked around. It was dark, and then he noticed something. There was no rotation from the beacon. The lighthouse was supposed to send out a sweeping light beam every few seconds, even during maintenance. It was a huge deal if the light failed. He got up and shook Russell awake, and the 2 of them made their way up the narrow spiral staircase to the top of the tower to see what was going on. When they got up there, they found the gears that rotated the beacon were still moving, but the actual light itself wasn't turning. Something was jammed in the mechanism. It was a large, dark piece of cloth, like a blanket or an old coat wedged deep into the gear assembly. The thing was soaked, covered in the slimy, mossy substance, and it smelled like rotting seaweed and mildew. They were both confused. The door had been locked, and the windows were sealed. No wind or birds. It didn't make sense, so they removed the fabric, tossed it outside into the wind, and went back to bed, thinking it was just some bizarre one-off incident. The next night, the exact same thing happened again. Around the same time, just after 2, Nate woke up and saw that the beacon wasn't turning. They went up and found another piece of cloth jammed into the same mechanism. Only this time, it wasn't the same type of fabric. It was smaller. Looked like an old-fashioned scarf or a shawl. It was red, frayed at the edges, and soaked through with what looked like ocean water. It even had tiny crustaceans clinging to it, like it had just come out of the sea. Nate said that was the moment things stopped feeling coincidental. They checked the doors, the windows, the supply closet, but everything was secure. Now they were starting to wonder if someone was messing with them, or worse, if something had gotten into the lighthouse and was deliberately trying to screw with the light. From that night on, they began blocking the stairwell with heavy crates after doing the final check upstairs. They locked the beacon room and the bottom entrance religiously, but on the 7th night, something happened that Nate still refuses to try to explain. He said he was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when he heard Russell whispering from across the room. But he wasn't talking to Nate. He was murmuring to the corner of the room, saying strange, disconnected things, like someone was standing there. Nate leaned up and asked what he was saying, and Russell blinked slowly and looked confused. He told Nate he wasn't saying anything. But later that night, Nate woke again and found Russell sitting at the window, staring down at the rocks below. When he asked what he was doing, Russell said he thought he saw someone standing down there on the rocks the night before, barely visible on the edge of the beacon light. He said it looked like someone was watching them, and then disappeared when the light rotated back. After that, things started spiraling. Russell got weirder every day. He stopped sleeping, stopped talking much, and just stared out the window for hours. Nate asked him if he was okay, and Russell would just mutter about noises in the wall or about hearing voices from inside the stairwell. On the 9th night, they both heard footsteps on the stairs. Not the usual creaking from the wind, but real, slow, deliberate footsteps, one after the other, coming down from the beacon room above. Nate looked over and saw Russell standing at the bottom of the stairs, frozen and staring up. He asked him if he'd gone up there, and Russell just looked at him and said no. Then he asked if Nate had. Neither of them had moved. They stood there listening, but the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. That night, they shoved a dresser in front of the bedroom door and slept with knives under their pillows. On the 11th night, they were woken up again by the beacon failing. This time, when they reached the top of the lighthouse, the beacon room door was wide open. Not just unlocked, not just cracked open, completely swung open like someone had kicked it in. The wind was howling through, and when they got inside, the beacon wasn't just stopped. It had been deliberately tampered with. The bulb was unscrewed and placed upright in the middle of the room. That thing is industrial grade. You can't just twist it off by hand without effort. Nate stared at it, terrified, while Russell just kept muttering that someone had done it. Then, Nate felt something brush against his back. Something cold. He spun around, but no one was there. Russell had gone pale. He just kept pointing at the wall, whispering that he saw a hand come out of the bricks. They ran back down the stairs and locked themselves in the bedroom. Nate didn't sleep at all. Russell started rocking back and forth in the corner, whispering to someone who wasn't there. The next morning, Nate used the emergency sat phone and called for an early pickup, saying there had been a serious mechanical failure. The boat showed up that afternoon, but here's the creepiest part. When they arrived, the crew asked them about the distress call they had made at 2:12 a.m. that morning, but Nate had never made any call. He didn't touch the phone until daylight. The deckhand said they'd received a garbled call that came through with static and a voice saying something about someone being there with them. Then it cut out. Russell didn't speak the entire ride back. He quit the Coast Guard a few months later and never told anyone what really happened out there. Nate still does maintenance duty sometimes, but he says he'll never ever go back to Matinicus Rock. This happened during COVID lockdowns. It was around the point of it where everyone was really getting sick of it and going stir-crazy cooped up in their houses with nothing to do. I was single at the time and was swiping on Tinder and just DMing people while watching movies and shows because really what else was there to do on a weeknight during lockdown? I struck up a conversation with some girl I'd been following on Instagram for years. Her name was Sophia. She goes by Soph. We live in Suffolk County, Long Island, New York, about 20 minutes to half an hour from the Hamptons and like an hour from Montauk. We were bored one night and agreed to hang out. She lives like 5 minutes from me conveniently, so I picked her up. We went for a drive to a nearby park that was closed, and we just drank White Claws there. I immediately got the vibe she was a little rebellious, but like in a cool way. She was down to hop fences and trespass and do things like that. There was a mutual connection very quickly, and within less than an hour, she came up with the idea of driving out to Montauk and walking the cliff walk around the lighthouse. Technically, the lighthouse grounds were closed past sunset. I think they may have been closed in general during lockdown, not 100% sure on that. But right away, I said I was down. I like adventures like that. So we finished our drinks and drove all the way out east to Montauk Point. When we got there, she told me to just park in the lighthouse parking lot. I was a bit hesitant about this, but she seemed pretty confident that there would be no security on a random Tuesday night during lockdown in the off-season. I mean, I didn't see any cars in sight, so I took her word for it. She said she'd done this before, even before COVID. We parked and had another White Claw in the parking lot. I would nervously look around from time to time, making sure no security vehicles were scoping the place out, and she would tell me to relax. We eventually started walking over to the lighthouse. Seeing a lighthouse at night so closely and just staring up at it, it's so cool, but it's also a bit eerie. Can't explain it, but there's something kind of liminal about it. Soph led the way. I guess it was a bit out of the way of the actual entrance, just so we wouldn't be walking directly into the light and potentially exposing ourselves. This was my first time ever at the Montauk Lighthouse. She led us straight to the cliffside behind the lighthouse that had a bunch of rocks forming a trail of sorts called the Cliff Walk. We were navigating solely with our flashlights. Maybe there were supposed to be lights on down there, but that night, mostly everything was off besides a few lights by the front entrance and of course the lighthouse light itself. As we started making our way around the cliff walk, being mindful of our steps, eventually, Soph, who was walking behind me now, said my name. I turned to her, and she was pointing her light behind her, exposing someone behind us also on the rocks. With both of us shining our lights over, it was easier to make him out. He was wearing a coat with a hood over his head. He looked like he was a black guy, but we couldn't tell how old or anything else about him. I called over asking if he worked here, and he didn't answer, but he also wasn't moving either. I followed it up with, "We're gonna leave, sorry." I was mostly nervous that it was a security worker or something and that we were gonna get in trouble, but then the guy said something to us. He said, "Y'all wanna buy some coke?" Finding out that wasn't a security guard, but simply a random guy was not a relief at all. If anything, it was more nerve-wracking, because why the hell was this creepy guy following us? Why was he even here? I said, "No man, we're good," and motioned for Soph to keep moving. I let her go in front of me, and we pressed forward. As we walked along, the guy started moving too. He didn't follow up with anything, like, "You sure?" He remained silent, but he seemed to move at the same pace as us. Soph or I would glance back with our lights every so often, and he'd be the same distance away. It was the strangest, most uncomfortable thing. It made the rest of the experience tense as could be. We made it to the end of the cliff walk and hurried through the grass back to the car. That guy from before was still following, basically matching our speed. We heard him call something over to us. It sounded like, "Where are you going?" This guy was obviously looking for trouble. I didn't want to instigate anything, so I didn't respond, and I told Soph not to as well. We walked side by side quickly to the car, and that's when we noticed two more guys walking over from behind us as well. I didn't want to run because that would definitely lead to them chasing us, but one of the other guys called something over to us as well. I didn't hear what it was. We got to the car and hurried inside, and Soph and I screamed when we both realized the three guys were right on top of the car now. I locked the car immediately, I swear, only seconds before two of them tried opening different doors. I put the car in reverse, basically the only direction where I wouldn't be hitting any of them with the car. They kicked and hit my car as I reversed out, but they didn't bother chasing us once we were in motion. On the ride back, I know that both of our hearts were racing, and after the adrenaline wore off, we were both quiet. We called it a night after I dropped her off. We ended up hanging out many times after that, and we're still in touch today. But honestly, that night still unsettles me. It was too close for comfort to something bad happening. My friends think it was a gang, Crips maybe. Whatever it was, I have no interest going back out there at night. My name is Gregory. This was a story my old friend Ian has told me many times that happened to him many moons ago. I asked him to give me a detailed version in writing recently that he gave me permission to share online because I always found it so unsettling. Ian was one of those guys you only had to meet once to know he was the real deal. 50-something, solid build, weathered skin from decades working in salt air. He worked in marine salvage and coastal infrastructure. Basically, when something broke near the water, Ian was one of the people you'd call to go fix it. But he wasn't just a contractor. He'd been a diver, a ship technician, even spent time doing remote inspections for the government. The guy had seen just about everything, so when he told me this story, I didn't doubt it. Not for a second. He said it happened back in 2013, when he got hired by a small county up in Washington state to do a structural inspection of an old decommissioned lighthouse. The county had inherited the property years earlier and didn't know what to do with it, Developers wanted to tear it down, historians wanted to preserve it, and no one wanted to pay for it either. So Ian's job was simple: go there alone, assess the place inside and out, and figure out whether it was even safe to restore. The lighthouse was on a remote rock island about an hour off the mainland. Not a big island either, just a hunk of stone and dirt maybe 300 feet wide, with nothing but the lighthouse itself, a generator shed, and some rusted out old scaffolding from decades past. The place hadn't been used in years, and it wasn't exactly a tourist destination. There weren't even any docks, just a little ledge where a small Coast Guard boat could offload someone at high tide. Ian packed light: food for 4 days, a sleeping bag, some tools, a clipboard, and a two-way marine radio. The plan was simple: he'd get dropped off Monday morning, do a full walkthrough by Wednesday, and call in for pickup Thursday afternoon. He didn't think twice about going alone. He'd done this sort of thing dozens of times before. When he first got there, the place was quiet. Cold, cloudy, but calm. The air had that usual mix of salt, metal, and decay you expect from something that's been sitting abandoned for decades. The lighthouse itself was tall, maybe 50 feet, built in the early 1900s. It had the classic spiral staircase inside, which led up to the beacon room. That glass lens hadn't worked in decades, but the structure itself was solid. Ian did his usual safety checks: support beams, stair integrity, window fittings. The floorboards on the lower level were warped but walkable. The second floor was a storage room, which was empty except for some rusted metal cabinets. The third floor had a tiny sleeping quarter that hadn't been used in decades. He ended up laying out his sleeping bag on the ground floor near the generator room where it was warmer and out of the wind. The first night was uneventful. It was quiet, like too quiet, Ian said. You don't notice how noisy the world usually is until it's not. There were no birds, no insects, not even the sound of waves slapping against the rocks outside. Just wind, and even that was soft. On the second day, the fog rolled in thick. Ian woke up to a completely white world outside. You couldn't see more than 5 feet beyond the window. He said it wasn't like any fog he'd seen before. It was so dense it looked solid, like a wall, but he didn't think much of it. That area got heavy fog often. He spent most of the day taking notes on the upper stairwell. That's when he noticed the first weird thing. Halfway up the staircase to the beacon room, there was a maintenance closet built into the wall. He'd tried to open it on day one, but the hinges were so corroded it wouldn't budge. But now it was open a crack. Not much, maybe an inch, but enough that you could tell it had been moved. He figured the moisture in the air had caused it to shift, but he didn't like it. The inside of the closet was pitch black, and when he pushed the door wider, he saw something sitting in the back corner. A wooden box, maybe the size of a lunchbox, and it was covered in a kind of damp moss, like it had been underwater recently. He didn't open it. He just shut the door again and made a note to report it. That night, something woke him up. He said it wasn't a sound exactly, but more so the absence of sound, like everything had stopped. And then he heard footsteps on the metal stairs above him. At first he thought an animal got inside, but then he realized they weren't descending. The steps were going upward. Whatever was in the tower was climbing. He turned on his flashlight and stared at the stairwell entrance, waiting, but nothing happened. Eventually the sound stopped and the silence returned. The next day he searched the whole place, top to bottom. He checked every room and every closet. He even climbed onto the roof, but there was nothing. No animals or anything out of the ordinary, except that box. It was now sitting outside the closet, halfway into the stairwell, still covered in moss. He said he stood there for a long time staring at it, trying to decide what to do. Eventually he picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. The wood was bloated with moisture, but the lid didn't open. It was nailed shut. He didn't want to mess with it too much, so he left it at the base of the stairs and went outside for air. That's when he noticed something else. There were footprints in the dirt around the lighthouse. Bare footprints. Not boots or shoes, but bare wet feet, leading from the north side of the building toward the cliff edge and then stopping. The footprints didn't circle back. They were just 10 or 12 barefoot impressions in the mud that ended at a sheer drop into the sea. He said he stood there for a long time trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone had come ashore, but the only boat scheduled was his return ride, and that wasn't for another day. He considered using the radio to call for an early pickup, but the fog was so thick that by then, they probably wouldn't even be able to navigate back. He went inside and locked every door and hatch, and then he wedged the stairwell shut with an iron pipe, and he tried to sleep. That night was worse. Around 1:30 a.m., he heard the door to the upper beacon room slam shut violently. He said the force shook dust loose from the ceiling. Then came the knocking. 3 slow knocks on the inside wall of the tower. Not the front door or window, but the wall itself. Like someone standing just inches behind the plaster, tapping their knuckles against the brick. Ian didn't move. He lay there frozen until the sound stopped. When the sun came up, he checked everything again. The box was gone, and the closet door was fully open. At this point, it was abundantly clear he wasn't alone there, so Ian used the radio and called for immediate extraction. The fog was still heavy, but he told them it was a medical issue. They said they'd try to get a boat there within a few hours. He packed everything and waited by the landing ledge. The fog didn't clear. In fact, it apparently got thicker. He sat there for nearly 7 hours, unable to see anything more than a few feet in front of him. The sun was going down, and the air had gotten cold. He heard someone walking behind him in the gravel near the base of the lighthouse, but when he turned around, there was no one there, or he simply just couldn't see who it was through the fog. He ran to the edge of the cliff and stayed there until he heard the boat horn in the distance. They pulled him out just after dark. The deckhand who helped him on board asked why he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Ian told him that the lighthouse was unsafe and should be sealed off. He filed a brief report back at the office. He said the structure was compromised and not fit for entry, but he never mentioned the footsteps or the box. He told me he didn't because he genuinely considered the possibility that he simply was losing his mind in isolation. This was around the end of what Ian sent me in writing. Ian never went back to that lighthouse. He wrapped up his remaining projects that year and quietly phased himself out of field work. Within a year, he stopped taking contracts altogether, said he wanted to focus on dry land from then on. When I asked if it was because of the lighthouse, he just shrugged and said he'd seen enough out there. I pressed him once, just once, about what he really thought happened on that island. He looked me dead in the eye and said something that kind of stuck with me ever since. He said, "Some places are meant to be left alone. They just need time and silence." That was all he'd say. I tried to look into the lighthouse myself a while back, but I couldn't find much. The coordinates he'd scribbled in his notes don't point to any listed structure. The county records mention a decommissioned tower somewhere off the coast, but there's no official name and no accessible history. It's like he was never really there in the first place. And that's the part that unsettles me most. Not what Ian said, but what nobody else ever did. I don't honestly know whether I hope Ian really was just for whatever reason going crazy on that island or not. During a road trip, I was passing through Ohio. It was around that time I was starting to get sleepy behind the wheel, so I stopped in this small town called Xenia. I looked for a hotel or motel and found this place called Xenia Country Inn. It looked a little run down, but so did this whole town if I'm being honest. Plus, all I needed was a night's sleep. Nothing fancy, so I parked in the lot and went to the little front office, which was in the front corner of one of the 2 buildings to the motel. There was an old man sitting there reading the paper. It was hot in there, and there was a loud buzzing sound from his tabletop fan. I asked for a room, and the man finally looked up from his paper without greeting me, and said $65. I assumed he meant $65 for the room, so I handed him my credit card. I asked if it's possible to get a corner room, and he simply said no. The customer service here was clearly not something included in the price. The man handed me this old-fashioned key on an otherwise blank key ring. They still didn't use key cards at this place. I walked across the parking lot to my room. The door was actually hard to unlock. I had to shimmy the key a little just to get it to finally turn. Before walking in, I looked around the lot, and there were only 2 other cars in the parking lot. It was a ghost town. I stepped into the room, and it smelled like a mix of cotton and vomit. I wondered if I should go back and ask for a different room, but I realized by the look of this place, all the rooms probably smelt. The room was small, and had a blue, dirty, worn-out looking carpet, a couch, a small coffee table, and a bed. I shut the door and tried to lock it, but I was having trouble. More trouble than I did unlocking it. After about 30 seconds of shimmying and almost popping a blood vessel trying to unlock it, I felt I may have broken it. But when I tried opening the door, it wouldn't open. So even though the door wasn't fully locked, as long as the door wouldn't open, that's all that mattered, I figured. I crawled up in the bed, and I heard all the old springs squeaking as my weight pushed into the mattress and the bed frame. I tried putting on the TV, but of course the remote didn't work. So I just crawled under the covers and tried to go to sleep. Then it happened. I nearly jumped out of my own skin when there was one loud thump at the window. I looked at the guy standing outside of it, and he started talking, sounding all hurt and in need of help. He was saying, "Hey, please let me in, I hurt myself bad, I need help." And he definitely saw me in that bed. I yelled back to go to the front desk. He wouldn't stop though. There was no way I was opening that door. I had a feeling he was acting and this was a trap. Eventually, after ignoring him for long enough, he left. I turned to check and confirm, and he was gone. I hadn't realized how truly unsafe this area was. I had to get up and check the lock on the door just to be safe and make sure the door wouldn't open. I gave the door a couple good pulls, and it didn't open. I then closed the curtains in front of the two windows so that he couldn't come back and look in at me again. That shook me up a bit, but the nerves calmed within half an hour, and I was able to fall into a half sleep not too long after. I started having this weird dream where I was in a closed supermarket running from the manager who was chasing me, and at some point during the dream, these clicking sounds started taking over, to the point that my whole dream shifted to incorporate these sounds, and then with that, I was awake. The room was cold for some reason. Then I looked down and realized the blanket was pulled off of me. I sat up to pull it back over me, but then I saw at the foot of the bed, there was this tall figure looming over me. Before I could scream, he went shh and told me not to move. He told me he wouldn't hurt me if I didn't make any movements or sounds. Then he asked me where my wallet was. I told him in my jeans pocket on the floor. All I saw was this figure towering over me in the bed, moving away from the foot of the bed to my jeans on the floor. I heard him rustling with the jeans, digging through the pocket until he found it. Then he asked what else I had in there. I was just taking a road trip. With that, he didn't say another word and left. I ran to try and relock the door as soon as he left, having the same trouble as earlier. I then called the police, but they were of no immediate assistance. We went to the guy at the front desk, who played back the video footage caught. However, the guy who entered the room was wearing a face mask and a hat, hiding all of his features. I got my money back and left. Thank God I didn't have much cash in my wallet. I canceled all my cards and slept in my car. I learned my lesson, never to stop at a sketchy motel. Early last year, my father and I traveled down to do some charity work in a small town that was flooded from recent rainfall. We had gathered a truckload full of donated clothes and items to help families get back on their feet. The first night, we stayed in a hotel that had a perfect view of the ocean. That night, my dad and I stayed up watching the Blair Witch Project on my laptop using the hotel's free Wi-Fi. Let's just say I didn't get much sleep. The next night, my mom had booked us a room at a motel, seeing as we didn't expect to stay a second night. It was 100 meters away from a trailer park, and the property overlooked a large lake. The area was tucked away from the public and was surrounded by trees. My mom claimed that everywhere else was fully booked, so we had no other options. We met the two managers who ran and lived at the motel. There was an old lady who was sweet and informed us about everything we needed to know, including the fact that the lake hadn't been full for 20 years. Her husband, however, looked like he was taken straight from a serial killer movie, him being the serial killer. He never spoke a word to us, he never smiled. His wrinkles melted on his face, and he had dark rings around his eyes. That's when my dad and I started to have an uneasy feeling about that place. The rest of the day went by in a blur, so my dad and I went out for pizza and a movie afterward to avoid going back to that place as much as possible. Once we arrived back at the motel, it was around 8 p.m. and it was completely dark. As we went to the back of the truck to get our luggage, We found a bag of children's clothes hidden underneath a spare tire. We began to walk the bag over to the trailer park, thinking that a family may get good use out of it, when I felt the sudden urge to go back to the motel, seeing as we watched a scary movie last night coincidentally about teenagers encountering a witch in the woods. We went to the front desk with the bag and asked the creepy old manager if we could leave it with him to donate to the trailer park, seeing as they were neighbors and we had to leave early in the morning to go back home. His eyes widened and he shook his head while saying, "No, there's no way in hell, I refuse to go there." Then he walked off. Dad and I just looked at each other, saying with our eyes, what the hell just happened? We then decided to drop it off in the charity bin back home. We went to sleep once we had all our showers, which was about an hour or so later. I specifically remember waking up at 2:17 a.m. because of Dad's snoring. I stayed up reading a book on my phone. My body faced towards the door. I also remember hearing cars speeding up and down the driveway that night. I let the thought slide, thinking it was just some guys goofing off. That assumption later vanished after I noticed a bright blue light appear through the cracks on the top and bottom part of the door, and silent whispers coming from the other side that I was unable to decipher. I was too scared to even move. I was frozen in the spot. My heart was beating in my throat and my hands were shaking, and I mean literally shaking. I heard the door handle begin to rattle, and that's when I knew that this wasn't going to end well. The light then disappeared, followed by complete and utter silence. I was still frozen in that spot for another 3 minutes, which felt like hours, before I woke up to my dad and told him everything that had happened. He then laughed and explained to me that earlier in the night he couldn't sleep due to hearing scratches in the walls right beside our bed. I was confused and didn't believe him until he put his finger to his lips while saying, "Shh, do you hear that?" Everything went silent until I heard brief scratches coming from our bed frame. I shot out of the bed and told Dad that we needed to leave, so we left the room key on the bed while sneaking off to the truck. We ended up leaving at 2:32 a.m. Never will I ever go near that motel ever again. Long story short, my ex-girlfriend and I had a pretty explosive relationship and we didn't get along very often. We were on this weekend trip in the mountains just to go sightseeing and hiking because we thought it would be good for us. But shit hit the fan in the hotel room on the second night, and basically I couldn't sleep in the same room as her. Instead of getting another hotel room for myself for like $150, I drove literally down the road to a motel and stopped there to stay for a fraction of the price. My logic was, if I left for the night and gave her time to cool off, maybe things would be better by morning. I got a room for, I'm not lying, $50 for the night. When I was walking towards my room, the room next door was wide open. As I passed, I looked inside, and it was lit up by the blue glow of the TV screen. Though from the angle I was at, I could not see what was on the screen. I didn't see anyone inside, but then again, I didn't stop to look like a weirdo. I proceeded to my room. It was a modest, normal-looking motel room for the price. Just a queen-size bed with a typical tacky floral bed cover, a TV, and a sofa. I wasn't really tired, so I just laid with the TV on and played games on my phone for a while. There was some weird noise from what I thought was coming from the TV, so I turned it off, but the noise persisted. It wasn't the TV. So I got up and listened, and realized it was coming from the room next door. I couldn't tell if it was a fighting couple, if it was the TV from next door, or if it was the sound of someone dying. It was just incredibly muffled. At this point, I had nothing else to do but to try and go to sleep. But then there was a banging on the wall separating the two rooms. I got up and went closer to the wall, and it happened again. It was without a doubt someone on the other side pounding on it with their fist. Why were they doing this? I can't say I wasn't a little freaked out, but I had to just be a man and confront them. I went over next door. Surprisingly, the door to the room was still open and the TV was still on, but there was no sound. I knocked on the open door, asking if there was a problem or if someone needed help. There was no response. I could even see that the bathroom door was open and the light was off. I stepped into the room slowly, cautiously. When I cleared the wall blocking the view of the sofa and the bed and still saw nobody, I just stood there all confused like. I went closer to the TV to look at what exactly was on the screen. It was just a blank blue screen. But there was a sticky note on the screen. It had writing on it. I picked it off the screen. It said, "Check under the bed." I dropped the note and ran out of the room, slamming the door. I ran back to my room and made sure to double lock the door with the chain lock. I crawled into bed and texted my girlfriend telling her what just happened and that I was freaking out. She called me immediately and I started telling her over the phone. As I was mid-explaining it, there were more bangs on the motel room wall. She heard it clearly because I put it on speaker. I started freaking out, and she told me to run to my car or to the front desk. I chose to run to the front desk so I could get my money back. I told the guy at the front desk that he should go to the room next to mine and kick the person out, but he looked at me and laughed and said that there was no one staying on either side of that room. He seemed to know immediately that they were both vacant. I told him he needs to check it out and that I needed my money back. So he went with me with the key to the room in his hand and unlocked the door. But now the TV was off and the room was dark. He walked inside and checked under the bed as the note had said. Even the post-it note that I dropped on the floor was gone. He refused to refund me, but it was $50. I didn't care. I left and went back to the hotel to my girlfriend and was glad to hug her and sleep in the same bed as her. I don't know what I witnessed in that motel room. I don't know who or what was under that bed, and I don't want to know.
My two kids, Sam and Robbie, are twins. They're 6 years old. A year ago, we were living at our old house, but something happened that led to us moving. It's a long, awful story. I lived in my old house for 4 years. My wife Carol and I got married while I was living there, and we had our kids there too. The neighborhood was slowly changing, and not for the better, but even still, we originally planned on staying in that house for the foreseeable future, until this happened. We were a corner house, and the house behind us on the intersecting road was covered by a bunch of tall trees and bushes, so we hardly ever saw those neighbors. Our neighbor on the right, however, his name was Steve. He had just moved there less than a year ago at the time. I had only ever spoken with him a couple of times. Both times I could hardly understand what he said because of his heavy accent, and he just overall didn't seem like the friendliest guy. 2 of his windows overlooked our backyard. There wasn't much privacy. But whatever rooms the 2 windows were that overlooked the backyard, I had never seen the lights on in either of them, so I always assumed it was an unused guest room or something of that nature. One day in the summertime, Sam and Robbie were playing in the backyard in their blow-up pool and with their water guns while I was outside doing yard work. There came a certain point where I was walking towards the detached garage, and then I saw Steve next door at his window for a second. Only half a second after noticing him did he turn and walk away from the window. It was slightly odd for sure, but I left it alone. Later that day, as the sun was going down, the kids went back outside to play again. It was a very hot day, so they went back in their blow-up pool while Carol and I were in the kitchen as she was making dinner. Then the kids' laughter went quiet for a while, and suddenly Robbie came inside and said there was a flashing light from the neighbor's window. I had to follow him to the backyard to ask him to show me what he was talking about. He pointed to one of Steve's upstairs windows that overlooked the backyard, and he said there was a white light that kept coming from that window. I right away assumed the worst, and asked the twins if it looked like a camera flash. They both said yes. I told them it's time to dry off and come inside. So I helped them dry themselves, and then brought them in, where I went to tell Carol about this. She right away assumed the worst just like me. She said I should go next door and knock on Steve's door. So I did. But when I did, he never answered the door. His car was even in the driveway, so he had to be home. After a few attempts at knocking and ringing the bell, I gave up and went back to my house. I told Carol he wasn't opening up, which made what the kids said seem even more credible. While we couldn't prove that the white light the kids were seeing was a camera flash, it sure did sound like it, and it was concerning to hear. Some time passed, maybe even weeks, before one night when Carol and I were in the bedroom, we heard our side gate being quietly opened and closed outside. Carol wanted me to go check outside, so I stepped out into the backyard and looked around. I had on all the lights as I searched. I found nothing and nobody, but I noticed the lights in Steve's backyard were on. I went over to look over the fence into his yard, and I nearly jumped out of my skin when he came up to the fence from the other side and asked if I needed something. I asked him if he'd seen or heard anyone sneaking through our yard. He said no. I took this time to also ask him bluntly if he had by chance been watching my kids, as they thought someone was at his window taking pictures of them playing in the pool. His reaction to this was a bit suspicious. He acted overly offended to my asking this, almost yelling at me for such an accusation. Again, without proof, I couldn't, nor did I want to, start issues with a neighbor. I apologized and went back inside. Carol was not happy about this, saying he's full of shit. The next incident didn't happen until another few weeks later. This time it was in the middle of the night when we were asleep. I woke up to Carol shaking me in a panic. I looked around the room confused at first, but then when I heard the kids screaming from their room, I exploded from the bed and ran downstairs to the kids' room. Robbie was awake and crying, and I found out a few seconds later that his crying and screaming had awoken Sammy, who was crying and screaming in reaction to him. Robbie said there was someone outside the window a second ago, and there was a camera flash from the window. I got goosebumps, but I also felt my blood begin to boil. All I could say was, "What did he look like?" He said he didn't see. I brought the kids up to our room to sleep in the bed with us. With the lights off, I peeked out our bedroom window to look across at Steve's unlit house next door. I looked at each window of his house, and I found him. He, just like me, was peeking out one of the upstairs windows, in that same room that overlooks the backyard. I stormed outside next door and rang his doorbell like 15 times. He never opened his door. I did call the police just to make a report on Steve. That way, if any future reports were made about him from other people, maybe the police department would look into him. I never saw him again. Sometimes I'd sit out front waiting to see him outside, but he'd clearly avoid coming outside when I'd be out there. Because of this, we ended up moving within a month to a new house in a different but nearby town, which has proven to be a better place to raise the kids anyway. About 3 months ago, I moved into an apartment with 2 other women so I could attend college. There's a list of things that make the building we live in not that great. For example, most apartment rooms face the corridor, where people from the same floor as you will constantly walk left and right to get in or out of the building. So if you keep your windows open, anyone pacing outside can see into your room. But considering I spend most of my time at college, and the girls I live with and most of the neighbors are really nice, the things on that list don't really bother me that much. A few nights ago, while getting ready to go to bed, I could hear music playing from somewhere, mostly pop songs from the 2000s. Since we live in a student-friendly city full of frat houses and the likes, I thought nothing of it. There were probably a bunch of parties going on and the sound was coming from one of them, or maybe it was just some drunk friends listening to it on the street. I got into bed and let a random video play on my phone so I could fall asleep, as I often do. But as I was starting to doze off, I started to hear drilling noises. At first, I thought I was just sleepy and hearing things, or maybe it was coming from my phone, but I paused the video and listened closely. There was definitely someone using a drill somewhere nearby. I got up and walked around the apartment feeling confused. It was around 11 p.m., so there was no way that someone could be working still. The sound was louder at my bedroom window, so I opened it to check, and quickly realized that it was coming from the neighboring apartment, the one that's closest to my window. At that moment, I realized that music was also coming from there. No one lives in that specific apartment, so my confusion only grew. But then I figured maybe someone had planned to rent it, talked it over with the landlord, and he ordered for something in it to be fixed. Still, the fact that they were doing it so late into a Thursday felt really strange. I went back to trying to sleep, but they wouldn't stop making noise. I was texting a friend and eventually started complaining about it, sending him audios and even a video directed at the window that all the noise was coming from. He said I should call the police because there was no way it was legal for someone to be doing this, especially in a building full of apartments. I decided against it since I just wanted to get some rest, and it was already past midnight by then. I forced myself to sleep through the drilling sounds, but a little past 1 in the morning, I woke up again, this time to hammering. Feeling stressed, but not enough to take action just yet, I tried to sleep once more, only to wake up again. This time, I didn't even check what time it was. I was totally fed up. So I just put on a robe and made my way to confront whoever it was. The window to the apartment was open, so I decided to talk to those people from there. The window was located above the stairs though, so I would have to go down a few steps to get into view, and I'd look even shorter being seen from there. But that was the last thing on my mind. As soon as I got to the window, I felt most of the courage leave me. In that room, there were 4 men who all seemed to be around their 30s or 40s, and they all stopped whatever they were doing to look at me. Now, only the song coming from the radio could be heard, and somehow it felt chilling to have all those other noises stop so abruptly, because even though that's everything I wanted just seconds earlier, I definitely didn't want to be the one thing these 4 men were focused on. Another thing that bothered me, but I didn't think about it until the next day, was those men's peculiar choice of music. It just felt creepy to realize that middle-aged men were listening to stuff that teenagers or even preteens would be listening to. Anyway, none of them looked shocked to see me. They just had puzzled "what's that" looks. Remembering why I was there in the first place, I said, "Excuse me, it's pretty late and most people here have work early in the morning. If it's not too much to ask, can you guys do this some other time?" Now, mind you, I'm a pretty short and puny 19-year-old who didn't even think to put on something other than a robe. So when 2 of those 40-something-year-old men came to the window and towered over me, looking up and down at my body, almost like predators, I froze up and felt the hairs in the back of my neck stand up. They were both sweaty and had their mouths agape, and one of them had a hammer that looked quite heavy in his hand. They started smiling in a sick, twisted way, and I felt a sudden urge to throw up. Extremely unsettled, I started slowly making my way back to my apartment, not taking my eyes off the men, feeling like they might try to grab me when I got to the last step of the stairs and close enough to the window. As soon as I was out of their view, I dashed to my front door, got inside, and locked it. One of the girls who lives with me was out of town that night, and I presumed the other one was asleep, since she hadn't seen my text on our group chat asking them if anyone had moved into that apartment. I got back into my room and didn't hear any tools again. In reality, even the radio seemed to have been turned off. I wasn't really sure how to feel about that, because now I wasn't angry, just disgusted and creeped out. I know I should have called the cops by then, but I was just too stressed to deal with that any longer. Checking the time, it was about 2:15 now. I got into bed again, tricking myself into thinking I wasn't scared, just craving some sleep. Eventually, I passed out. I woke up in the middle of the night again. This time it was around 3:30, and I could hear no sounds coming from the apartment. Everything was quiet, and that quickly started to bother me. It was too quiet. I had to have heard or felt something in order to wake up. The silence was making me uneasy, and I had a feeling that someone might have been on the other side of my closed window. I tried not to think about it, but I couldn't get a peaceful sleep after that. The next morning, as I was going out, I went past the same window and noticed that it was closed. It was as if this previous night had never even happened. But I asked the girl who was home with me if she heard anything. She said she had woken up several times during the night, but couldn't get up and do something about it due to sleep paralysis. Either way, that confirmed I wasn't delusional. Those people really were there. But then, how did they have the keys to the building and that apartment? Why did it seem like they didn't want to be seen during the day? What were they thinking of doing to me or maybe any passerby? It's been a week now, and thankfully I haven't seen those men again. Still, I have no idea who they were or what they were doing, and I'm honestly scared to even think about the possibility that they might come back, or still be lurking around somewhere. I live in a pretty basic suburban town on Long Island, New York. My girlfriend Sarah and I recently started renting a small house perfect for 2 to 4. We have a decent sized backyard and our house is on a very quiet street. One side of our house has a water drainage basin, as the county calls it, which is just a bunch of trees surrounding a sump. On the other side is our neighbor Kyle, who lives with his wife. They're a bit older in their 60s and quiet. Then directly across the street is a little patch of woods that's in front of another water drainage basin. So for people who like privacy out front, our house is perfect. But then there's the backyard. Kyle's house is blocked off by some bushes that the landlord planted years ago. So besides the house directly behind us over the fence, there's no other houses that could see into the yard. However, that one house looking into our backyard was all that it's taken to genuinely make Sarah and I uncomfortable. As I'm writing this, it's currently the fall, So we've been doing fall cleanup the past few weeks in the front and backyard. I started noticing anytime we were out there were these two people standing at the upstairs window of the house behind us. It was a middle-aged man and woman. When I'd look up to that window, they'd keep looking and watching me. It got really uncomfortable to the point we'd pretend not to notice it, but we could only stomach doing this for so long. The leaves kept falling day by day, and the fall cleaning would need to continue. Sarah wouldn't want to be in the yard anymore because she was getting so creeped out at those two people who would watch us out the window without fail. So one foggy day while raking, I looked up at the window and once again, the two were standing at the big rectangular window. I decided to wave at them, see if they'd wave back. After a few seconds of smiling and waving, they didn't move. No reaction. But I could feel their stares and I could see their eyeballs looking at me. I turned away from the window and tried to continue raking, but after sneaking a peek back at the window a couple minutes later and seeing them still there, I felt too awkward and weird being out there. I went inside. Sarah said we should go over and introduce ourselves. At first, I was hesitant of that, but I was persuaded to walk around the block with her to that house and ring the bell. We expected one of those people at the window to answer the door, but instead, the door cracked open, just enough to see half of a person's head. It didn't look like either of those people who were always at the window. It was also super dark in the house, to the point that it looked incredibly ominous and uncanny staring at half of that person's face. This guy looked a lot younger, like in his 20s. Sarah and I tried to be friendly and introduce ourselves. The guy seemed very closed off though, and not interested in speaking. He had a very "what do you need" type of attitude about him, and when I asked if he lives with anyone else here like his parents, he said no. I mentioned the man and woman who were always at the window upstairs, and the guy on the other side of the door said he doesn't know who I'm talking about. Sarah and I felt really unsettled, so we just left. But weirdly, as we walked down the walkway back to the sidewalk, I noticed the guy behind the door was still peering half of his face through the cracked open door. I'm sure he watched us walk away until we were out of sight. That interaction was weirder and creepier than we were expecting. When we got back home, I went upstairs to our room. The upstairs of our house is only our master bedroom and the bathroom. It has 2 windows. One of the windows looks over to that house over the fence, and I looked out the window to see those 2 people looking out the window again, and even at this distance, I felt like they were staring right at me. I shut the blinds and went down to tell Sarah. We agreed it was time to plant some arborvitaes to block their window from view. The only problem is it's already the fall and it's too late to plant any kinds of trees. We have to make it through winter. After a few days of not looking outside the bedroom window or going into the backyard, one night we heard a strange knocking sound from downstairs. I told Sarah to wait in bed while I went downstairs. The knocking got louder, and I quickly discovered it wasn't the sound of knocking on one of the doors, but rather on the glass of one of the backyard windows. The blinds of it were of course shut because we didn't want those creepy people looking into our living room at night. I approached it, and yes, it was 100% a fist knocking on the glass. I considered saying, "Who's there?" but I froze and I was too scared. Instead, I flicked on the backyard light, and then the knocking stopped. I didn't even want to look out the window or door. I kept the light on and then went back upstairs to my room, where I told Sarah about the creepy knocking, but I claimed that I chased whoever it was away. I exaggerated in fear of sounding like a coward. I also didn't want her to worry. We both imagined it to have been something to do with that house though. Nothing has happened since, but I'll have to update throughout the winter. Update. It's been 2 weeks, and we haven't seen those people at the window ever since. But last night, we heard yelling and screaming from that house. I had to open our window, and it became clear there were muffled yells coming from that house. The fact that we heard it through 2 sets of closed windows just goes to show how loud the yelling was. Then, out of nowhere, it just stopped and went quiet. We almost called the police, but ultimately didn't. I'll update again if anything else happens, but we're really getting creeped out here now.
"3 years ago, my partner and I bought our first home. It was a modest place, and our neighbors were wonderful. Life was good,
So good, in fact, that 18 months later, when those neighbors decided to sell their house, which was larger and had more luxuries like a driveway, a garage, and a bathtub, we jumped at the chance. We bought their house and put our old one right next door up for sale. After reading several motivation letters from potential buyers, we chose a Polish couple. They only spoke in English to us and not in Dutch like we did, but everything seemed normal. They asked for some tips about the house, and we had some pleasant, small-scale small talk. But looking back, that was the calm before the storm. Even before the big incidents, things felt off. We started experiencing bizarre disturbances at the strangest hours. Sometimes at midnight, we'd hear heavy banging or incredibly loud music blasting through the walls without warning. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to make us feel like we didn't truly know who was living a few feet away. The first red flag appeared when the neighbor came home with severe damage to both sides of his car. It looked like he had scraped against a guardrail at high speed on both sides. When we asked what happened, he gave a clumsy excuse: a concrete pole on one side and a trailer taking a turn too wide on the other. We chose to believe him, even though the math didn't add up. One evening around 6 p.m., the neighbor called us in a total panic. He claimed people were outside his house, turning his security cameras away. He begged us to check it out and call the police. We looked, and sure enough, 2 men were breaking in. We called the cops immediately. It took the cops 20 minutes to arrive, so the burglars were already gone. The neighbor's wife came racing into the street, parked her car, and frantically ran inside to her sweet little French bulldog, and the police, who were at the time already there. When I was walking my dog curiously, I saw the husband park his car 3 streets away and walk to the scene, as if he was hiding the vehicle from the police. But that thought didn't occur to me at the moment. Later, when we checked the doorbell footage, we saw the burglars standing there before the break-in, calmly discussing which house to target in Polish. Nothing was stolen, no one was caught. I told the police it felt like a setup, but I never heard back. A week later, I was at a housewarming party when my partner texted me, "The music next door is insanely loud again." A few minutes later, he called me, and his tone changed to pure terror. The neighbor's car had just come tearing through our front garden and slammed into the neighbor's own front door. 2 men were frantically loading the car with high-end electronics, like flat-screen TVs, professional speakers, and other expensive gear. They looked like the same men from the week before. This time, the police were a lot quicker. They arrived in exactly 7 minutes. The officers intercepted the men while they were still loading the car. When asked for ID, the men claimed they didn't have any. Then things got surreal. The man behind the wheel looked the officer in the eye and claimed to be my neighbor using my neighbor's actual name. But there was a catch. In the 9 months that they lived next to us, my neighbor had never spoken a single word of Dutch. This man, however, spoke fluent Dutch with a thick Polish accent. Realizing the game was up, the men slammed the car into gear, and a violent pursuit followed through our quiet streets until the police managed to box them in and arrest them. But my partner could still hear movement inside our neighbor's house. The police went back in and dragged out a 3rd suspect. As we were inside our own home with an officer to report the damage to our property, the doorbell rang. We turned around, and there he was, the actual neighbor. He was unrecognizable. His face was a swollen, bloody mess. One eye was swollen shut, his mouth was torn, and his arm hung at a useless angle, covered in what looked like defensive stab wounds. He looked feral, aggressive, and broken. The police officer tried to intervene, but the neighbor flat out refused to file a report or cooperate. Since the victim wouldn't speak, the officer had no choice but to send him back to his house. Later that night, the neighbor rang our bell again. He was trembling. He confessed that he cheated on his wife, and he claimed that she had sent people to take him out. He begged to sleep at our house. Terrified and wanting no part of this underworld drama, we refused. My partner offered to drive him to the hospital instead. We dropped him off at 10:30 p.m., telling him we were staying elsewhere for the night because we no longer felt safe. But we didn't stay elsewhere. We went home, locked every door, and tried to breathe. At around 1 a.m., our dog started growling. A specific low growl he only uses when someone's at the door. We checked the doorbell camera, and there he was. The neighbor was back from the hospital, standing on our porch, ringing the doorbell multiple times. We sat in the dark, watching the screen in silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a car turned onto the street. The neighbor panicked. He scrambled off the porch and hid behind our cars in the driveway, crouching in the shadows. Watching this bloodied, broken man lurking in the dark behind our own cars was one of the most unsettling things I've ever seen. The car stopped, and a woman got out. It was his wife. She walked toward her front door, paused, and glanced at our driveway. She saw him. We held our breath, waiting for a confrontation, or worse. She walked toward him, and as she stepped into the pale yellow glow of the street lamp, she began to wail, a haunting, guttural crying. He didn't say a word, and she kept asking questions, her sobbing getting louder and louder, echoing through the empty street. Eventually, they both got into the car and drove away. We didn't see them for 3 days. We didn't even know where their dog was. The wife eventually returned alone. She found the dog inside, and she told us she doesn't think she'll ever see her husband again. Whatever the real story is, drugs, debt, or marriage turned lethal, I've realized one thing. I don't think I want to know. This all started back in 2017 when I moved into a new house in the suburbs of Montreal, Canada, with my parents and little sister. Before I get into the juicy part of the story, I need to explain a few details about my room and its placement in the house for everything to make sense from my point of view. The house we moved into is a split-level home, meaning it has staggered floor levels connected by short flights of stairs. My room was neither on the main floor nor in the basement. It sat exactly in between the two, at ground level. One wall shared space with the garage, and the opposite side had a large window that looked out into the backyard. At the time, that window had plastic vertical blinds with several missing panels, so even when they were fully closed, I could still see outside through the gaps. On the garage side of my room was my closet, which had large sliding mirror doors. This meant that when I was in bed, no matter which side I faced, I could always see my window reflected back at me. I started noticing things about a year after we moved in, when I was 15. I remember watching YouTube videos on my tablet late at night since I had trouble falling asleep. One night, I heard something outside my window. I had left it open because it was really hot and we hadn't invested in an AC unit yet, so I relied on whatever breeze I could get. After hearing what sounded like footsteps or shuffling, I quickly paused my video and put the tablet down. The noise stopped along with the video, which made me think it had just been part of what I was watching, or maybe my imagination. I resumed the video and heard it again. I looked to my left toward the window, but didn't see anything. So I eventually fell asleep. For a few nights, nothing happened. But then one night, a couple nights later, during my usual late-night YouTube and show watching routine, I heard the shuffling again. I paused what I was watching and listened, this time longer than before. I swear I could hear breathing now too. I glanced at my window, but again, there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and turned to face my closet instead. As I picked my tablet back up to resume the video, I saw something move at my window through one of the gaps in the blinds, reflected in the mirror. A chill ran down my spine. I got up immediately and went to wake up my parents, deciding it was better to be safe than sorry. I told them what I had seen and heard, and even though my dad clearly doubted me, he went outside to check the backyard. A few minutes later, he came back saying he had checked every corner and didn't see anything. He told me that if someone had been there, he would have heard them come in through the squeaky gate, or he at least would have heard them leave. He also checked the Ring camera, which showed no one walking around the house toward the backyard. I suggested that the person could have jumped the fence into the neighbor's yard, but he quickly shut that down, saying we lived in a safe neighborhood and that I should stop watching scary movies. Unfortunately, I believed him and went back to bed. Every couple of weeks or months after that, I'd hear things again. Each time, I convinced myself it was all in my head and tried to focus on my videos or fall asleep. When winter came and everything was covered in snow, it stopped, and I eventually forgot about it. But the following year, it started again. It didn't happen often, once or twice a month at most, and always past 11 p.m. I tried not to pay attention to it, even when the noises sounded like clear footsteps or deep breathing. I watched a lot of scary movies and videos, so I kept telling myself that had to be the reason. I avoided looking at the window altogether, even though I tried to believe it was all in my head. Part of me was terrified of being proven wrong. One night, against my better judgment, I looked. Not directly at the window, that was too scary. I looked at the mirror instead. This time, I swear I saw the silhouette of a person. I ran upstairs again, and once again, after checking the entire backyard, my dad told me the same thing he had the year before. And once again, I believed him. This went on for a while. I started going to bed earlier, watching videos louder or with headphones, and completely avoiding my mirror, or worse, looking directly at my window. It always stopped when the weather got colder and started again in mid-spring. One night in early December of 2021, there was a huge windstorm. I was watching a stream with my boyfriend over Discord when I decided to grab a glass of water around 11:30 p.m. On my way, I noticed my parents sitting in the living room. It caught me off guard since they rarely stayed up that late, let alone outside their bedroom. Their faces looked tense and preoccupied. I asked if everything was okay, but they brushed it off, assuring me it was nothing. I assumed I had walked in on a conversation not meant for my ears and headed back toward my room. As I turned toward the stairs, flashes of red and blue light caught my attention through the front window. A police car was pulling into our driveway. My parents immediately stood up as if they'd been expecting it, and they rushed me to my room, telling me they'd call me if needed. I wanted answers, but I knew it wasn't time to push, so I went back to my room, curiosity eating away at me. Not even 2 minutes later, I was called back upstairs. This time, they didn't keep me in the dark. My dad explained that about 15 to 20 minutes earlier, during the windstorm, he had stepped into the backyard to make sure nothing had been blown over before going to bed. While scanning the yard, he noticed the light from my bedroom window illuminating something near it. As his eye adjusted, he realized it was a man standing motionless just outside my window, staring in. My dad yelled at him and started moving toward him, but the man immediately turned and ran. He jumped the back fence effortlessly, as if he'd done it 100 times before, and he disappeared into the neighboring yards. In that moment, everything I had feared for years stopped being a possibility and became a fact. I hadn't imagined it. Someone really had been there. Terrified, my parents called the police right away, and then went to knock on the neighbor's door to warn her. The older woman who lived there didn't open the door. Instead, she yelled at them to leave or she would call the cops herself. The police eventually arrived, but since my dad hadn't gotten a clear look at the man, there wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in the area and recommending we install more cameras, which we did. In retrospect, my back neighbor's reaction still feels deeply suspicious to me. Why was her first response to threaten my parents when all they did was knock on her door to warn her? It raises a couple questions, such as, was she living with that man my dad saw? Or had she seen him too and genuinely thought it was him knocking? Did I know the person who stood outside my window for years, or was it just some creepy neighbor who noticed a teenage girl's room with poorly covered blinds and took advantage of it? Did he only want to watch, or was he working up to something else? Even now, those questions haunt me. Knowing that someone was really there the entire time makes every sound I brushed off, every breath I thought I imagined, and every silhouette I forced myself not to look at feel so much more terrifying. I've since switched rooms and can't look at windows facing our backyard the same way anymore. Thank God mine now faces the street. What scares me the most isn't that it happened, it's how long it went on for, without anyone knowing, and how easily it could have continued. It was a cold winter day in mid-December, and I was 15 years old. I originally lived in a suburban area of Alberta with my parents in our apartment. However, We were running low on space, and with my little sister on her way, we knew we had to move to a bigger house. It seemed lucky for us at first, because there was a house just a few blocks down that was selling for a very cheap price tag. Granted, it wasn't the best looking or in the best area, but it had room to grow in, and for the price we paid, we could renovate to our heart's content. My dad did renovate slightly with the money we had left, but mainly the basement, as it was almost unusable without being fixed up. Cleaning, carpeting, new beams, fixing the bathroom, and fresh wallpaper with a cool pattern I got to choose myself. For the first couple of months, living there had been great, and I was really enjoying the new house. Until the first questionable moment came along. It was my father's birthday, and to celebrate, we all had gone to a restaurant in the evening. All went well until we came home to our front door wide open. My mom was absolutely shaken, and we begged my dad to drive us away from the house while she called the police. My dad grabbed a large, heavy wrench from his toolbox in the truck and went into the house to search for the intruder. My mom and I called the cops anyway, and we sat there for 5 excruciatingly long minutes before they arrived. They searched the house and found my dad, and he came back out and told us nothing was actually stolen, and no one was in the house either. However, some of our items were moved or knocked over, specifically the books on my bookshelf. The police eventually finished their search and told us the same thing. We were still a little paranoid, but finally, we went inside our home. From that day forward, I would always hear strange noises coming from the walls, and sometimes underneath our basement. Might I add, my room was there, in the basement, but I always dismissed the sounds as the pipes. This was an older house after all. That was until one night something unexplainable happened. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was playing with my Nintendo DS under the sheets with no volume so my parents didn't know I was still awake. That's when I heard it. Clear laughter coming from the wall to the side of my bed. My heart froze in time, and my eyes probably widened to the size of plates. I didn't know what I should do. Ignore it? Call my parents? Go investigate? I decided to wait for a while to see if it happened again. But after about 30 minutes of laying still as a stone, I decided it must have just been my sleep-deprived imagination, and finally went to sleep. I woke up the next morning in my bed. As usual, nothing changed. Despite that laugh still burning in my mind, I tried to pass it off. I would still hear the same strange noises every so often for the next couple of weeks, but that felt normal for me now. This is when the next occurrence happens. By this time, my sister was already born, and since the basement was big enough, plus my mom trusted me with keeping her safe at night, she shared the room with me. Now, this doesn't mean my mom didn't use baby monitors, because she did. She kept the parent units in the living room, and the other in the kitchen. One night, my parents had gone out for a late-night dinner and left me to take care of the house until they got back. I was in the living room watching a movie when I got up to get a snack from the kitchen. That's when I noticed odd noises coming from the baby monitor. And my heart sank. I knew no one else was home, but those were footsteps. Loud, heavy footsteps. Suddenly, my fear was realized when my sister started crying, and I heard a faint shh sound come out of the speaker, followed by a crash. I instantly did the first thing that came to mind, which now, thinking clearly in retrospect, could have gotten us both killed. I ran as quickly as I could up to my parents' room and grabbed my father's rifle. However, I didn't have the key to unlock the trigger lock or any of the ammunition. I figured I would pretend it was loaded and try to hide the lock with my hand. If I was attacked, I would use the buttstock to defend myself. All I thought of was getting my sister to safety. When I got to the basement door, I opened it quietly and walked down the steps, turning to face my sister's crib. No one was there, but she was still crying, as well as the baby monitor being on the ground sideways. I mustered all the courage I could and yelled, "I'm armed. Come out before I find you." Still nothing. I grabbed my sister and ran upstairs. I closed the basement door and pushed a chair under the handle to keep it locked while I called my parents. They called the police and got home as fast as they could. The police got to my house before my parents did, so they made me sit in the back of the cop car with my baby sister while one of the police officers went inside to investigate. When my parents arrived, I told them everything that happened. They were confused but very concerned. They knew I wasn't the type of kid that would lie about something like this. The police officer came out and gave us an all clear and said no one was in the house. Just as they finished talking to us and were about to leave, my dad worriedly asked them if they checked behind the bookshelf. In my room, there was a bookshelf that came embedded into the wall, so I was very confused when my dad asked to look behind it. The police officer was confused too, and asked my father to come inside with him and point out what he meant. Lo and behold, when we got downstairs, my bookshelf was pushed open slightly like a door, and the basement window that leads to the backyard was opened all the way, with my desk chair planted under it. Behind the bookshelf was a small room with some of the pipes to our house, and the pipes wrapped around some of the walls. On the ground were some food wrappers, one of our cups that had gone missing, lotion, a switchblade, along with an apple that was partially eaten but still slightly fresh. Someone had been living in our house, and we didn't even know it this whole time. The police said that most likely while they were outside talking to us, whoever was here escaped through the open window. They said to call if we ever noticed anything suspicious. However, they didn't think the person would come back now that we knew of their secret. That wasn't even the most horrifying part, however. A few days later, I pushed open the bookshelf myself and explored it top to bottom. That's when I found a tiny hole in the wall, and when I looked through, it pointed directly to my bed and dresser. Whoever was in there was watching me sleep, get dressed, play my video games, do my homework, speak on the phone, everything. They knew most of my life. I'm an adult now, and I live in my own apartment with my boyfriend. My parents still live there 5 years later. To this day, I worry for them, and hope whoever that was never returns.
My son George has always had the strangest friends. I'm not sure why, but in his earlier years, he always attracted what would be considered the weird kids. I've got a ton of stories about this, but there's one that kind of sticks out like a thorn. He was in the 4th grade, and we had just moved due to my husband's reassignment, so George was new to his school. He had always been an outgoing and friendly kid, so my husband and I weren't particularly worried about his ability to make new friends. We were transitioning well as a family, and everything was going well with him at school. I was beyond pleased the first time I met all of George's classmates' parents, as they all seemed like upstanding, honest people. A few months after the move, I got a call from George's school in the middle of the day requesting one of his parents come in to discuss an incident involving him and another student. My husband was at work, so I assumed the responsibility and agreed to meet with the principal after picking up my son. I remember feeling a mixture of anger and confusion. Anger, obviously. I mean, my son had probably been in a fight, which I'd need to punish him for should I find out he was the antagonizer. But confusion as well. Physical altercations were very uncharacteristic of George, which made this more concerning to me. As I was walking him to the principal's office, he refused to answer any of my questions about the situation, which was also very unlike him. Usually, he was extremely talkative and what you'd call an oversharer, so his silence was somewhat unsettling. I figured he was either embarrassed or scared, so I didn't think much of it. The principal asked that George sit in the waiting room outside his office, so that's where I left him. After closing the door, the principal directed me to a chair in front of his desk, which is where I sat down. He began asking me questions about George, the kinds of questions you'd expect. How is his behavior at home? Does he listen? Does he talk back? Is he respectful? You know, things like that. I had nothing but positive things to say. George was an extremely well-behaved and respectful boy, and that's not the mother in me. I was just telling the objective truth. Eventually, the principal told me why I had been called in. Apparently, George had gotten into a brief altercation with a classmate after recess, a boy named Sebastian. I asked about the circumstances of the fight, and this is what I was told. They had been the last 2 students outside, and they were walking up the stairs together.
Seemingly out of nowhere, George pulled an eraser out of his pocket and struck Sebastian over the head with it, causing him to fall to the ground and start screaming. I was baffled. It was totally unlike George to do something like that without being provoked. Plus, I had heard about the Sebastian boy before. George spoke fondly of him, like they were close friends. I asked the principal more questions, but he didn't seem to have the answers, and ultimately admitted that no one had seen the incident, but both boys had independently confirmed details of the story. He then said that George wasn't in trouble, as a little fight wasn't too uncommon. He told me that he just wanted to inform me, and that no further action would be taken, which definitely calmed me down. After that, he excused me, so I left. George was still silent about the whole thing as I drove him home, and only opened up to me right before bedtime. Admittedly, I had grown frustrated with him for not talking to me, which was probably why he quit the silent act. He told me that Sebastian had tricked him. I asked him to elaborate, and he told me that they had been playing make-believe Street Fighter. As per Sebastian's instruction, George had pulled out an eraser for a KO move of some sort. Out of nowhere, Sebastian fell to the ground and pretended to be really hurt. He then whispered in George's ear that he'd seriously hurt him if George didn't pretend like he'd attacked him. So that's what George did, and all the teachers assumed it had been a real fight. Rightfully so, I was pretty pissed. My little boy had been taken advantage of and falsely accused. Instead of going to the school, I decided to handle things myself. That night, I went through the school's directory and found Sebastian's mother's phone number. She introduced herself as Maggie. I was kind of taken aback by how sweet and genuine she sounded on the phone. She told me she had heard about the incident, gotten the real story from Sebastian, and already reprimanded him. I thought it was kind of odd that Sebastian would have told the truth to his mother so soon, but I was happy I didn't have to do any convincing. She then went on to say that Sebastian had always had some minor behavioral problems growing up, and he'd sometimes think and act like another person entirely. I actually started to feel bad the more she told me. It seemed as if he wasn't fully in control of some of his actions. Maggie suggested that the boys schedule a sleepover to make up for the whole thing and become better friends, which I thought was a great idea. She offered to host, and I was appreciative of that. That weekend, I drove over to her house with George, who had returned to his bubbly, talkative self. Maggie invited me in, and the two of us got to know each other over some wine while the boys played in the basement. Like I said before, Maggie seems like a completely upstanding person, and I really enjoyed her company. I ended up staying for a few hours, and the time flew by. Eventually, I just had to ask about Sebastian's behavior, as it had been bugging me for a while. Her entire demeanor changed, and she lowered her voice a bit. She told me that he often had trouble making friends, and that he's seen a few doctors, all of whom think it's something he'll outgrow soon. She went on to say that he's gotten much better at controlling himself, and the fact that he was being more social at school was a good sign. I didn't inquire much more than that. I just wanted to make sure my son would be safe for the night. Maggie promised me George would be in good hands, and that Sebastian didn't have a history of getting physical or violent, more so just acting strange. That was enough reassurance for me. This woman was clearly genuine, and it actually felt kind of nice knowing that George would be helping Sebastian learn how to make friends. Eventually, it came time to leave, so I went downstairs to say goodbye to George. The two boys were laughing and playing Battleship. It looked like they were really getting along. I kissed my son goodbye and drove home. The next morning, I went to go pick him up. When I got to the house, he was waiting near the door with all his stuff and a smile on his face. I assumed the night went well. I said good morning to Maggie and packed George's stuff in the car. As we were driving away though, he started bawling out of nowhere. I asked him what was wrong in a concerned voice, and what he told me was quite literally jaw-dropping. George said that everything was going well until it came time to go to sleep. The boys had set up their sleeping arrangements in the basement, 2 air mattresses side by side. Everything seemed normal when they went to bed, but at some point in the night, George woke up. He wasn't sure why at first. Then he heard something. Whispering. It was coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly open, and there was a strange flickering light inside, not like a regular bathroom light. As George described it, it seemed more like a candle light. He He listened closer and realized it was Sebastian talking. But he wasn't just talking, he was having a full conversation. George thought maybe he was on the phone or something, but the more he listened, the weirder it got. Sebastian wasn't calling himself Sebastian, he was calling himself Mr. Jim. George felt frozen. It was like Sebastian thought he was someone else, and he wasn't talking to anyone, just the mirror. Then the candle went out. Everything was dark again. George squeezed his eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. A long time passed, and then he heard the bathroom door creak open. His stomach dropped when he heard whispering again, this time right above him. It went on for a while. George didn't understand the words. It didn't even sound like English. He just lay there, too scared to move. Eventually, Sebastian went back to bed like nothing happened. In the morning, he was totally normal again. George didn't dare ask him about it. When George told me what happened, I was horrified. My gut told me this wasn't just a case of childhood imagination. Something was wrong. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to tell someone. I called Maggie first. At first, she laughed it off, saying Sebastian has always been a creative kid, but as I pressed her, her voice faltered. Eventually, she admitted that his so-called behavioral problems were more serious than she let on. One psychiatrist had even suggested he was showing signs of multiple personality disorder. They had already moved twice before, she told me in a hushed tone, because Sebastian had been kicked out of school. I was stunned. Furious even. Why the hell hadn't she told me this before? Why would she put my son in danger like that? Then she did something unexpected. She begged me not to notify the school. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to respect her wishes, but another part of me knew that something was very wrong. I blurted out, okay, and hung up the phone before she could respond. I told myself I'd make my decision by the end of the week, but I never got the chance. That Monday, Sebastian full-on attacked another student at recess. It was serious enough that the school sent out a statement to all the parents, though they kept the details vague. By the end of the day, I found out that he had been expelled. I tried calling Maggie, but her phone had seemingly been disconnected. The situation was incredibly unsettling. Just days ago we had spoken, and now, suddenly, she was unreachable. I didn't even know what I wanted to say to her, just that I wanted to say something. There were no other numbers or emails in the school directory, just that one number that was now disconnected. A few days later, the curiosity got too overwhelming, so I bit the bullet and drove to her house. When I arrived, it was completely vacated. No moving trucks, no sign of a rushed departure, just gone. It didn't make sense. How could they have left so quickly? I tried looking them up, searching for any trace of them online. I found nothing. No forwarding address, no mention of them anywhere. It was like they had never existed at all. That was a long time ago, and George wasn't too badly affected by it. In all honesty, I think he's mostly forgotten about it. I haven't, though. I often think about what could have happened to my son that night in that basement, or what kind of things that kid Sebastian has been doing since. My upbringing was a little unorthodox. I grew up in a Southern Baptist household, the kind where we didn't believe in ghosts, but were absolutely certain about demons. Let me explain. If something strange happened, it wasn't a spirit or wandering soul. It was something darker, something biblical. I never fully bought into it, but the message was drilled into me from a young age. Rejecting demons meant rejecting scripture itself. My mother, though, was different. Faith was optional for her. She wasn't atheist or agnostic, just indifferent. She'd say things like, God and I have an understanding, whenever I pressed her about church. While I leaned into religion as a source of structure and stability, she drifted further from it. It was one of the many things that widened the gap between us. I won't sugarcoat it. My mother struggled with addiction, mental health issues, things she never wanted help for. Some days she was functional, others she was downright insane. I tried not to take it personally, but it was hard. Looking back, she definitely had schizophrenia or some kind of adjacent condition. But before you say anything about my family being neglectful of her mental health, it was a different time back then. One afternoon, I had a nightmare so vivid that I still remember every detail to this day. In the dream, I was lying in bed when my mother stormed into my room, screaming in a fit of rage. She grabbed me by the wrist and started shaking me violently. I woke up in a pool of sweat, my body still rigid with fear. But before I could shake off the dream, it happened again. Except this time, I wasn't asleep. The door barged open, and there she was, just as she had been in my nightmare. Same expression, same unhinged anger, same words. It was like the dream had been some kind of prophecy. I barely managed to push her off and yell for her to stop, and then it was over. She left as suddenly as she had entered, and when I confronted her the next morning, she had no memory of it. She seemed confused, even a little hurt that I was so shaken. I told myself it was a coincidence, some bizarre overlap between my subconscious and her moods, but part of me wondered if it was something worse. A few weeks later, I heard her screaming from the backyard. It was a strange sound, not a panicked scream or even a distressed one. The scream sounded more excited. I don't even know if that makes sense, but that's the best way I can describe it. I rushed outside and froze at what I saw. My mother was standing in the yard, grinning, holding a massive 7-foot-long snake in her bare hands. That was terrifying enough on its own, but there's something you don't know which made it even worse. My mother had a lifelong phobia of snakes. She couldn't even look at them on TV without recoiling. But there she was, gripping one like it was a toy. She said, "Come here," and motioned for me to grab the snake. I took a step back, shaking my head. I literally said, "Mom, what the hell?" But the look in her eye told me she couldn't even understand the words I was saying. She just smiled wider and tilted her head like she was trying to scare me. I couldn't deal with it. I turned and ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding. I peeked out the window and saw her still standing there, holding the snake like an offering. Eventually, she let it slither onto the ground and walked back inside as if nothing had happened. Later, when I asked her about it, she shrugged like I was making it up. She told me I must have had a strange dream and refused to entertain me when I continued to ask about it. That was nothing compared to what I'm about to tell you, though. That winter, my church held an overnight lock-in. I was relieved to go. Church was my escape, a place where I could be around predictable, normal people. My mother dropped me off completely sober and even kissed my forehead before driving away. At around 4:30 a.m., just as we were settling into sleep, a loud knocking echoed through the chapel. We all sat up, glancing at each other. The knocking moved, traveling around the building in an impossible way at times. It sounded like it was coming from multiple directions at once. It wasn't wind, it wasn't an animal. It was rhythmic, circling the chapel like someone or something was trying to break in. The pastor, the only one with a key, was asleep in his office and hadn't heard a thing. I ran to wake him, and as soon as he stepped into the chapel, the knocking stopped. He opened the front doors and literally stumbled back in fear. Standing there, barefoot and sweating in the freezing air, was my mother. Her clothes were disheveled, and her hair was dripping with sweat. Her lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. She didn't acknowledge the pastor. Her eyes locked on me immediately. A slow, unsettling smile stretched across her face as she walked toward me. I wanted to run. The pastor tried to hold me back, whispering, "Stay here." But I felt completely powerless, like I had no choice but to go with her. I climbed into the car, afraid that she was going to do something, but she didn't. The drive home was silent. She didn't speak, didn't explain. She didn't answer when I asked why she was there. When we got home, she stopped in the doorway and just stared at me. She stood there silently watching me as I walked to my room. I closed the door, locked it, and lay awake for hours listening. In the morning, she was in the kitchen cooking breakfast. She was cheerful and clearly oblivious to what had happened the night before. She jumped back when she saw me, saying she was just about to pick me up from the church. I felt the blood drain from my face. She had no memory of knocking on the church doors, no memory of driving me home. It was freaky. I expected someone, the pastor, a church elder, even one of the chaperones, to say something about what had happened, but no one did. It was like they didn't know what to make of it, or worse, they didn't want to. That's kind of the way people treated my mom back then. That was decades ago. She's gone now, but her memory is something that will never leave me, for better or for worse. I don't know if I believe in demons or the supernatural anymore, but I can't explain what happens. The logical explanation is that she was suffering from mental illness, maybe addiction withdrawal, or maybe something else entirely. But the memory lapses, the eerie timing, the way she acted like a different person some nights, it still haunts me. I tell myself there's a rational answer for all of it, but even now, I'm not sure I believe that. My eldest son started sleepwalking when he was about 8 or 9. I had heard of kids going through phases like that, so I wasn't too concerned at first. It was just one of those things. A little unsettling, sure, but nothing I thought much about. I'm a pretty light sleeper, so none of my kids have ever been able to sneak around the house at night without me knowing. That's actually how I first figured out about my son's habit. Most nights, I'd wake up and find him standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, rocking slightly on his heels, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His eyes would be open, but they weren't seeing anything. That was the one part that always got me. For any of you who have lived with a sleepwalker, you know exactly what I'm talking about. His gaze would pass right through me, empty and distant, like he was looking past me into something I couldn't see. It was always extremely strange, and I never fully acclimated to finding him like that. Sometimes he'd mumble something under his breath, words too soft and slurred to understand. Other times, he wouldn't make a sound, just standing there, breathing in that slow, steady way that somehow made it even worse. I'd gently guide him to bed, whispering his name, telling him everything was fine. He never seemed to remember any of it in the morning. Things escalated a few months after I made the realization that he was a sleepwalker. One night, I woke up to a rhythmic tapping sound. It sounded like water droplets repeatedly dripping onto a window pane, only it wasn't raining outside. It was soft, barely loud enough to wake me. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, some far-off noise that my half-asleep brain had misinterpreted. But as I lay there, the sound continued, steady and deliberate. It wasn't sporadic like rainfall would be. It occurred at regular intervals, and always at the same volume. I kept listening, trying to figure out what it could be. It wasn't the house settling, and it wasn't the wind outside. It was too precise. Once I realized the tapping wasn't going to stop, I begrudgingly accepted that I'd have to deal with it. I sat up and looked towards the door, which is where the sound was coming from. My husband was fast asleep, and I didn't want to disturb him. I should mention that I wasn't scared, just curious. Otherwise, I probably would have woken him up. Anyway, I got out of bed to investigate. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw him. My son facing the wall, his forehead lightly knocking against it in slow, measured taps. His fingertips gently grazed the wall in rhythm with his forehead taps, as if he was trying to walk through it. I remember calling his name, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't react, just kept pressing his head forward, knocking it in that eerie rhythmic way, like he was testing something, like he was trying to push through. I stepped closer, but right before I was about to intervene, I hesitated. Something about the way he was moving genuinely sent a chill right through me. I gently reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder, shaking him just enough to pull him out of whatever trance he was in. He blinked, took a step back, and then, as if nothing had happened, let me lead him back to bed. He never mentioned it in the morning. It happened a few more times, but it was pretty infrequent if I'm being honest. I figured it was just another strange habit of sleepwalkers. Maybe some kind of subconscious response to the wall being there. Some internal sense of space that his dreaming mind hadn't accounted for. And eventually, he outgrew it. The sleepwalking stopped, and the strange, vacant staring in the hallway became a weird little memory that I mostly forgot about. That is, until my younger son started doing the same thing years later. The sleepwalking, I mean. At first, I brushed it off. Kids go through phases. Some behaviors repeat themselves. It was just so uncanny that both of them started sleepwalking around the same age. Again though, nothing too unusual. Genetics are a fascinating thing. But eventually, I started noticing the little details. The things that gave me a growing sense of concern. It wasn't just that he sleepwalked. It was how he sleepwalked. He stood in the hallway, shifting from foot to foot, his eyes open but unfocused. He moved the same way as my older son had, with that slow, eerie rhythm, like his movements weren't completely random. It was unsettling. It felt like I was living the memory of watching my older son do the same thing years earlier. But it got worse than that. One night, I woke up to that tapping noise again. I already knew what I'd see before I stepped into the hallway, and I was right. There he was, forehead pressed to the exact same spot, knocking against the wall like he was trying to step into something that wasn't there. It was the exact same behavior my older son had exhibited all those years ago, from the forehead taps all the way down to the way his fingers brushed against the wall. I called his name. Nothing. I touched his shoulder. Nothing. He just kept knocking, his small body swaying slightly, lost in some deep, unreachable place. And that's when it hit me. He had never seen his older brother sleepwalk. At least not that I know of. His brother hadn't done this in years. There was no reason for him to exhibit the same exact behavior. Not just the wandering, but the standing, the tapping, the eerie, misplaced urgency of it. I don't know why, but that thought made me feel sick. After some badgering, I eventually snapped him out of his trance. I guided him back to bed and tucked him in like I had done so many times before, trying to tell myself that it was just one of those things. And then, just like his brother, he outgrew it. Just like that, no more sleepwalking, no more tapping. He had no recollection of it either. For years, I didn't think about it. In all honesty, I had forgotten about the whole thing, but there's a reason I'm writing this now. My sons are away at college now, and the house is a lot quieter than what I'm used to. Because of that, my husband and I have to find new things to occupy some of that downtime with. A few weeks ago, we decided to renovate the house. The house is pretty old, and we've lived in it long enough that we've decided to change things up. New floors, new paint, some fresh updates to make the place feel new again. It was all minor work, nothing too intensive. We were stripping the old wallpaper when we noticed something underneath. At first, I thought it was just some old backing or maybe a weird stain, but as we peeled more away, my breath caught. It was an old, antique-style mirror, a mirror that had been covered for some reason. My first thought was, why the hell would someone cover a mirror instead of removing it? I felt ridiculous, standing there staring at a piece of glass like it was going to do something, but I couldn't help but feel like we weren't supposed to find it, like it had been sealed away for a reason. And that's when I realized the mirror was positioned in the exact spot on the wall that my sons had been bumping into all those years ago. The memories came flooding back, and I stood there in shock. There was no logical reason they should have known it was there. They couldn't have. And yet, somehow, they had. Both of them had independently been trying to walk into something that was impossible to see through the wallpaper. Forget about the fact that they were unconscious. I immediately got rid of that mirror, but I'm still pretty freaked out by the whole thing. There's got to be some kind of rational explanation for this, but I can't think of one. I still don't know what to make of this. I really don't. I'm 28 years old now, but I vividly remember a horrifying incident that occurred when I was a 22-year-old college student. I lived in Florida, in a fairly large house in Orlando, with a rather large property with a big pool outside. I was living with my parents at the time, and they both own their respective businesses and frequently travel for meetings and conventions and whatnot. One week in mid-May, when both of my parents were away, I asked their permission, and they allowed me to invite a limited amount of friends over to have a pool party in the backyard. I was excited and quite surprised that my parents trusted that I would be responsible enough to have a small party, promising no alcohol, no loud music, and to send everyone home at a reasonable hour, as to not disturb the neighbors. I proceeded to call 6 of my best friends and let them know about the pool party, inviting them over the following evening with a limit of 1 guest per person. Everyone replied almost instantly, totally down to come over, asking if they should bring over snacks and drinks. Remembering what my parents said, I ignored their conditions and allowed my friends to bring alcohol. The following night at around 8 p.m., almost all of my friends who I invited showed up with their bathing suits and plenty of alcohol. My friends took turns playing music on my Bluetooth speaker. They all brought their girlfriends or guy friends that were all acquaintances of mine, totaling 13 people including me. I started the backyard fire pit, and we started drinking, laughing, making idle chit-chat, and some of my friends decided to go into the pool. Most of my friends jumped in off the diving board, and I sat by the fire watching them splash, pick their girlfriends up, slam them in the pool, and have a good time in their now drunken state. Almost 2 hours passed, and I remember what my parents said about allowing guests to stay late. It was now approximately 10:30 p.m., and most of my friends were still in the pool listening to music, and occasionally coming out for snacks and more booze. Myself in a rather drunken state, I kind of lost track of time. I went inside of my house for a few moments to grab another beer, when I heard leaves rustling from the bushes on the side of my property. Now keep in mind, my house is gated and has security cameras all around, so I didn't get too suspicious, and I didn't think much of the sounds, figuring some of my friends may have made their way to the front of the house to either make out with their girlfriends or get ready to go home. At that point, it was already 11:30 p.m., and I completely failed to adhere to all my parents' rules, which actually made me feel a little guilty. I went back outside with snacks and drinks and told everyone that it was almost time to end our evening. 10 out of the 12 of my guests were still in the pool screaming and horsing around, while the 2 others went missing. When I realized this, I went back inside, walked around the house, and heard laughing and moaning from upstairs in one of the guest bedrooms. Assuming that one of my friends snuck upstairs with his girlfriend to hook up and whatnot, I don't need to give an explanation. I was too drunk and lazy at the time to go upstairs and tell them it's time to leave. But before I returned to the backyard to finally close up shop, I heard blood-curdling screams come from the pool. I ran outside to find my pool filled with blood on the surface, with my friends screaming that one of their girlfriends was swimming, and felt an arm tug them down, and must have had a knife cut them on their leg. All of a sudden, an unfamiliar face, a guy probably in his late 20s, with long, scraggly hair, a scruffy beard, tall with a couple tattoos on his body, emerged from the pool and ran out in a pair of fatigue cargo shorts and bolted to the front of the house. A few of the guys tried to chase after him, but they couldn't find where he went. We all panicked and took my friend's girlfriend and went inside the house, with a couple from upstairs hustling downstairs to see what the commotion was. I locked the doors while calling 911 requesting an ambulance. When the police and paramedics came to my house, they took the injured girl into the ambulance, and the rest of my friends left the house, confused and shaken up by the events that just took place. The police and I went to review the security footage, and lo and behold, when I heard that rustling in my bushes, there was the guy, who somehow made it over my gate undetected, went to the side of the house and casually blended in, and went into the pool with the rest of the guests. Stupid me didn't think of checking the surveillance system. Too drunk and concerned about my friends having a good time, that I irresponsibly let an intruder enter my parents' property undetected. I gave the footage to the police, but to this day, they were never alike to identify the intruder, and of course when my parents returned, they found out what transpired, scolded me, and never allowed me to have a party in the house again. I was once invited to a pool party when I was 17. One of the more popular kids in our school was throwing a high school graduation pool party one weekend where his parents wouldn't be home. The kid's name was Daryl, and he had a huge backyard with a nice in-ground pool perfect for pool parties, though most of us have big yards where we live because we're in a less congested town. I wasn't close with Daryl, so I hitched a ride with a couple friends who knew him better. When the three of us stepped into his backyard, it was packed. It was actually impressive how many kids were there. I'd say at least a quarter of the entire grade was at this party. We wanted to say hi to Daryl because it would be the right thing to do coming into his party. We asked a couple kids we knew if they'd seen him. They said they hadn't seen him for a while now, so we asked others and got similar responses. We soon realized nobody seemed to know where Daryl was. Maybe he was in his house with a girl or something. So we just went about our own business. We played beer pong, people splashed around the pool, and the night became a daze overall. I didn't jump in the pool because I didn't bring a bathing suit and I just didn't want to get wet. Throughout the night, I would hear other kids screaming, "Where's Daryl?" It seemed others were trying to find him because it was weird he hadn't been seen for nearly 2 hours. Me and the two friends I came with joined a little circle of people talking about how Daryl hadn't been answering his text for a couple hours. Still, people were just chalking it up to maybe him being upstairs with a girl. Who knew? It was his party after all. Anyway, some more time passed and I had to go to the bathroom. There were a bunch of people inside the house, and there was actually a line for the bathroom. I opened a door in the hallway and it led to the basement. My house had a bathroom in the basement, so I figured there was a chance this one did as well. I turned on the light in the basement and walked down. I started looking for a bathroom. There were only 2 doors down there though. The first one led to a closet. There was another door on the other side of the basement. It was shut, so I went over to it and tried the doorknob. It was locked. I knocked on the door. There was no answer. The thing about this lock though, it seemed I would be able to pick it unlocked simply using my fingernail. So I did just that. I knocked again before opening the door. I was expecting to see a bathroom, but instead I saw a big pitch black room. It seemed to be a boiler room. However, there was the faintest little yellow light emanating from what appeared to be some kind of boiler machine in the far corner of the room. And in that light, I could see a person, surely a person, standing right in the back of the room. My heart dropped when I saw the person duck down behind something. I thought, what if that was Daryl? I looked for the light switch and found it. It was one of those hanging switches that you pull down. I turned the lights on and went over to where I saw the person hide. The room was cluttered with tables and a washer and dryer machine, so the walking space was kind of arranged in a circle. When I got to where I saw the person not even 20 seconds earlier, I saw Daryl laying on the floor in a bloody mess, apparently passed out. I looked back up to the door to the boiler room when I heard footsteps coming from that direction. There was someone rushing out the doorway, but for a split second they looked back and I instantly recognized the face of a kid named Todd from our grade. He was a very quiet kid that creeped out a large amount of people in our grade. Instead of calling the cops and tending to Daryl, I ran upstairs hoping to catch up to Todd to make sure there were other witnesses to his presence there that night. I made it upstairs to the hallway and started to scream for people's attention. Everyone who was in the living room came to look and could see Todd rushing out the front door. They saw him. They were now witnesses to his being there. I told them all to come downstairs and see what he did. I would have considered rushing to tackle him, but I didn't know what weapons he had on him. When we all got downstairs, we saw multiple stab wounds in Daryl's legs. First thing we did was call 911 for police and an ambulance. Daryl was rushed to the hospital, while at least 10 people vouched for me when I saw a kid in our grade named Todd at the scene of the crime. That same night, police apparently raided Tom's house and he was arrested. I'm pretty sure he's still in jail. Not sure if they got him for attempted murder or what. Daryl is fine now, but everyone believes that Todd did what he did out of jealousy of Daryl's popularity. Todd didn't seem to have any friends in school and would often be picked on by kids in Daryl's friend group. I'm not saying Todd was justified at all, but it's scary what bullying can drive some people to do. When I bought my first house, I had a pool party on a Friday. It was supposed to be my housewarming party, I had a few of my closest friends over. Everyone drank a bunch, and a few hours later, people were on their way out. A couple friends